seated. Ms. LaViolette, please come forward and take a seat. Ms. Wilmot, we need a cup.
I'm afraid
Oh, behind the water.
They're behind the water pitcher, thank you.
Do you want me to pour it for you?
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. LaViolette, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Wilmot, you may continue.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, Ms. LaViolette.
Good morning.
I want to start talking a little bit about some of the other things that you've done throughout your career, okay?
All right.
Have you ever worked with police before?
Yes, I started doing volunteer training with the police in 1980, first in the squad room with officers around the issue of restraining orders and protective orders that law had just gone into effect in 1980, and then into cadet academy, and then into advanced officer training. And I did that probably for at least about 10 years until the police department started doing all its own training in-house, and then I stopped doing that.
All right, and have you ever worked with large corporations?
Well, actually, I've done some training in corporations, like the Housing Authority, and that sort of thing, but I am on the board, the advisory board of the Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence.
What is that?
It's an organization that was formed by State Farm Insurance because back in the 90s, State Farm stopped insuring women who claimed they were battered women, or where they knew they were battered women. They were counting it as a pre-existing condition. And so there was a lot of bad press that went out with State Farm, and they thought they had to do something about that. And they did. They pulled together 100 people from around the country who were educators, business people, and people who worked in domestic violence. And we put together a plan to have corporations and other organizations and domestic violence folks work together to prevent violence. And so they're working with lots of organizations. Liz Claiborne is one of them. Mary Kay is one of them. They have people from the NFL. But State Farm has continued to do that. And I'm on the advisory board, which actually means I do pretty much nothing. My name's just on the advisory board.
But did you do something when it first started?
I did. I worked really hard for 3 days when we worked 12-hour days to put this plan together.
All right, and when was this?
It was, it was the mid-90s, but I'm not sure the exact year.
Okay. And when you're doing trainings, and you're giving a speech, I would imagine, to a group of people. Do you ever, in those trainings, I mean, it's obviously about a very serious topic, but do you ever use humor in your trainings?
I do use humor in my trainings.
Why is that?
I use humor in my trainings because it's such a serious topic and because it's hard for people to listen. And some of my trainings are all-day trainings, but even if they're 2-hour trainings, it helps people to take it in. It's easier to listen if you can occasionally laugh and spend some of the tension that you have when you're hearing about things like this. So, for instance, I tend to say things kind of spontaneously, and I was asked once why people come into my program. Why would they?
It explains what she does with regard to training. It goes to her experience.
They ask, why would people come into your program? And I said, well, for the most part, people don't come into my program because they think personal growth is far out and they can't wait to do it. That they come in either because their partners leave or threaten to leave and they really take that seriously, or God speaks to them through the SWAT team and they have a religious experience. And so people thought that was funny and they laughed at it. And I also said that I think it's a very hard thing for people to ask for help. That asking for help when you hurt people that you love is a very difficult thing. And so being able to sort of balance that out helps people to listen and helps people to take things in, I think.
All right, and in your experience, have you ever worked with the military?
I currently work with the military, but it's in a program called Heroes and Healthy Families. I do training. I've done training at 29 Palms, Camp Pendleton, and Barstow for the Marines, and for both the family services folks in the Marines and also for the Marines themselves. Heroes and Healthy Families is a really wonderful program that a judge in California, Judge Isles, and her court assistant, Leslie Howard, put together. And it's basically to expand the notion of not leaving your buddies behind to include mental health issues. And it's supported by the generals. It's a really wonderful program. And what they do is they expand the notion to suicide, homicide, child abuse, spouse abuse, substance abuse, and they have speakers on all of those topics. In fact, there's a YouTube video that I didn't put on there. I found out one of my friends called and said, "You're on YouTube, Alice." I didn't know I was. And it was from Heroes and Healthy Families, and it's on PTSD and domestic violence. And so they use all of those videos, and they have people from the military speak, primarily from the military speak, and then I speak for those groups too. And they're usually 600 to 800 enlisted men, sergeants, usually enlisted men that come. And then there are retired military. We've had Congressional Medal of Honor winners speak about wishing they had gotten help and that sort of thing. So it's very moving.
You talked a little bit about when you first started in the late 70s and early 80s that domestic violence wasn't something that people really paid attention to. Is that right?
That's correct.
In the beginning, when you first started training and speaking about domestic violence and battered women, did you ever face any type of discrimination or type of name calling, being called things like a man-hater or being accused of things like that?
Objection, relevance.
Approach. You may proceed.
Thank you. So, Ms. LaViolette, did you face that type of discrimination when you first started?
Yes, I did. And I think for the most part, people in the movement did. And part of it was justified, I think, because there was a lot of anger in the movement at that time to get things done and to try to see laws changed and that sort of thing, because there weren't any laws at that time. But I think pretty quickly people
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
May we approach? All right, so during this discrimination, what kind of discrimination did you face?
people seeing us as angry, people seeing us as prejudiced, people seeing us as trying to push an issue that wasn't worth pushing, that sort of thing.
Okay, and ultimately, did you told us yesterday that you actually worked with men,
Yes, I do work with men.
and that's from the beginning up until present day, is that right?
That's from within the first 6 months.
Okay.
Yes.
And from the beginning until present day, have you worked with women as well?
Yes, I work with men and women.
All right. Since you started taking cases for forensic reasons, in court-type cases, child custody and criminal cases, I think you told us that you've done about 16 to 18 for the defense and about 9 for the prosecution.
Yes.
In that time, have you ever been asked to represent somebody or be retained as an expert and turned a case down?
Yes, I have. I've turned down more than one case.
All right. And what are reasons why you turned down a case?
Objection, relevance.
Approach. Proceed.
Ms. Levine, when you've turned down cases, have you done that because you didn't have enough time to dedicate to that particular case?
Yes, in fact, I
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
So have you recently turned down a case?
turned down a case yesterday.
Okay, and is that because you don't have enough time to dedicate to it?
Objection has been answered.
Call the roll.
It's because I didn't have time to do a good job on a case, and I don't want to do a case unless I can do a good job on a case.
All right. And also, have you turned down cases because there's not enough information there for you to make a good analysis?
Yes, I've turned down cases where I didn't feel there was enough evidence to merit my participation in that case.
Okay. Now, you've been, have you testified before
Yes,
in other cases?
I've testified about 18 times.
18 times, okay.
Yes.
And have you ever testified or worked on behalf of, been retained by people who were representing a man?
Yes,
So have you ever testified on behalf of a man?
I was actually sitting in court to testify and was not called, but I sat there for 6 hours ready to testify.
Okay, and that for a client who was a man?
Yes,
Okay.
who was accused of domestic violence.
Oh, okay, so he was accused of domestic violence and you were on his side of the case?
Well, he was accused of domestic violence, and I was able to get him into a...
Objection beyond the scope of the question. She's being asked whose side she represented.
Sustained.
Okay, were you retained by his defense?
I was retained in a family law case. It wasn't a...
Not criminal.
It wasn't a criminal case.
Okay. And have you testified when clients have been women?
Yes, I have.
All right. And obviously you're testifying in this case. Were you retained in this case?
Yes, I was.
And do you remember when you were retained?
I was, I think, first interviewed in September of 2011, and I was, began working on the case in October of 2011.
Did you say, when were you first interviewed? September, did you say?
I think the very end of September or the beginning of October.
Okay. In 2011?
Yes.
And are you being paid on this case?
Yes, I am.
And how much do you get paid an hour?
$250 an hour for research and $300 an hour for court appearance.
All right. I want to talk to you some more about some of the articles that you've created, or that you've written, I guess.
Yes.
Did you ever write an article in a journal that, for child custody?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And in doing so, did you ever author something called a continuum of aggression and abuse?
Yes, I did.
And what is that?
The continuum of aggression and abuse is a way to look at domestic violence and aggression that can also occur in otherwise healthy families, isolated acts of aggression. And it looks at a range of behavior and a range of responses, and then looks at some exacerbating factors that can play into these cases. It's so that we don't look at domestic violence in kind of a one-dimensional way, but look at a real range. And part of that is to be able to look at how we intervene in these cases so that we're intervening more effectively.
All right. How did you go about making something like this?
Well, initially, I saw a continuum that was created by Michael Johnson in 1994. And he had a continuum that was anchored on one side with what was called common couple violence, and the other side with patriarchal terrorism, because what he was looking at were men who were in batterers intervention programs. And he was looking at what was called common couple violence, which was what he called most of domestic violence, which was hitting, pushing, slapping, grabbing, and what he called mild injury. And then looking at patriarchal terrorism, which was looking at not only extreme domestic violence, but the use of the system, whether that be a spiritual system, whether that be a criminal justice system, whether that be a child custody system, whether that's finances, but use of the system. And I liked that he did a continuum, but I thought it needed to have more points on the continuum than just two.
So how do you do that? If you have a continuum but you wanted to add more data to it or more information to it?
I wanted to add more breadth to it, but I also wanted to look at the fact that in healthy families, there can be isolated acts of aggression that happen in those families, and that we don't call everything domestic violence, that we look at a context that it's occurring in so that we're better able to describe it.
So is that part of what you did when you created the continuum?
Yes, I did that. And I also used, there was research done in the 90s by Amy Holdsworth Monroe and Gregory Stewart. And what they did was they took 10 pieces of research and they kind of put them together. And they took the similarities from each of those pieces of research and created what were called behavioral typologies, which are simply what are the similar behaviors in each of these groups of abusive people. And they were like family only, people who don't do anything outside of the family, and pretty much it's very hidden from everybody else, and moved to what was called borderline or dysphoric or overly controlled hostile, which are people that would act out more in public as well. And then they used antisocial. And antisocial were people that usually had some sort of experience in the criminal justice system, may have been arrested, may have a rap sheet, that sort of thing.
All right. Did you use that information to help create your continuum?
I used that, and I used my experience, and also I network regularly with people in the field. I'm in an organization, we meet monthly, and I talk to other people who are doing the work, and I talk to people around the country, and actually some people in other countries who are doing the work. And so I used all of that to put together my continuum.
All right. Judge, may I approach the witness? Yes. Ms. Violet, I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 558. Do you recognize this?
Yes, that's my continuum.
All right. This is something you created?
Yes, it is.
All right. And would it help you when we talk about the continuum to be able to look at it and be able to talk about it and explain it to the jurors? To be able to look at it?
It could help, but I know it pretty well.
All right. Would it help the jurors to be able to understand
It would help the jurors, yeah.
All right. Judge, defense moves for exhibit number 558 into evidence.
Objection, hearsay and learned treatise.
Approach.
Five 58 is submitted.
Okay, Alice, I'm going to show you. Sorry, Miss Violet. I will show you the continuum. Let's get it all on there. Okay. All right. All right, so what I want to do is I want you to be able to explain what this is, because just looking at it doesn't necessarily tell us what you've done here. So can we talk about what you have with the different columns
Sure.
and how it works, the columns versus.
Sure. It's actually a continuum and not just kind of linear, so there's range of behavior between the categories. But the first category, common couple, aggression, and I changed violence to aggression because that.
We're in the first column, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That would be considered an aberrant act, an unusual act in that family. It could be a family, for instance, when we see really difficult economic times like we are now, sometimes the stress that families are under, somebody winds up doing something that they don't normally do. It doesn't occur in the context of an abusive relationship. It is something where there's a balance of power, and the couple is basically in a healthy relationship, but there's some kind of escalation, there's some kind of stress in the family, there's some kind of buildup, and an isolated act of aggression occurs. And it doesn't create fear in the other partner. It doesn't create apprehension in the other partner because it's an unusual act. There's genuine remorse for it because it's not the way either person believes things should be handled.
Ms. Violet, can I interrupt you? When you say an act of aggression, can you give us an example of what you're talking about?
Well, it could be slapping or hitting someone. It could be throwing something. It could be a verbal act of aggression that is abnormal in that situation. So it's an act of aggression that happens in an otherwise healthy family.
Okay.
And there's no as I said, no power imbalance there. Age is also a factor because younger people, and I think, you know, I remember when I was in my 20s, I was a lot different with the way I handled conflict in my relationship than I was when I'm in my 60s. So I think most of us can look at the change in the way we handle things over time, and that when we have, you know, less life experience, less handling of conflict, that we have less experience in how we do it. So age can be a factor in this as well.
All right. And then you have things in that same column such as no injury.
Yes, in general, you would not see an injury.
All right. And could happen in any family. So is that exactly what it means?
Yes, it could happen. And what I mean by that is that most people, and some of what has happened over time, is that we've counted any act, particularly of physical aggression, as domestic violence. And although I don't think that's a good way to handle things, what I also know in working with families and in knowing lots of people is that people can have an isolated act of aggression and not be an abusive person.
Okay. And the balance of power in a relationship, what does that mean?
It means that basically they have a friendship and they work things out together, that they respect and like each other, and so when there's a decision to be made in the family, they make the decisions together, and they respect each other and like each other.
Okay. All right. And so you said this is a continuum. So does that mean that we kind of follow up here to high conflict?
Yeah, and high conflict is still not a domestic violence category in a sense, but it's a category of unhealthy relationship. It's a relationship where there may be a balance of power, but people are disrespectful and mistreat each other in a verbal way. There might be occasional acts of aggression, but they can go one way or the other, and they are not afraid of each other, because the development of apprehension tends to happen over time in a domestically violent relationship. In non-domestically violent relationships, you don't tend to see the development of apprehension over time.
All right. So, and what's anger is an issue in the family?
Basically that this couple has, you know, problems because they don't solve their problems. They don't come to a solution in conflict that really resolves things. And so what happens is over time, they stop really appreciating each other, and they basically erode the friendship that they have with each other. They just stop liking each other. So it might be a tense family. It might be a family where they treat each other disrespectfully, even in front of other people, that sort of thing.
All right. And we move from remorse to may have remorse.
They may be sorry that they did this, and they may just both feel so negatively about each other that they don't have much remorse, depending on how much goodwill remains in that family.
All right. And the sporadic physical aggression. So in other words, does that mean that we're looking at more than one aberrant act?
Yes, and you could actually see more than one aberrant act in common couple, but you wouldn't. I mean, I'm talking about a long-term relationship.
Okay.
So you could have more than one aberrant act. In high conflict, what makes the difference is that it goes back and forth. And if it were domestic violence, there would be, at least the more current research looks at that over time, if there's mutual aggression, that what winds up happening in a heterosexual relationship is that the male partner becomes, over time, more aggressive with an aggressive female partner.
Okay. And then can have emotional abuse?
Excuse me?
What is, in the column you have, can have emotional abuse?
Well, what I mean by that is that they are disrespectful and talk in a very disrespectful way to each other. And it's different than character assassination. Usually it's more name-calling, but name-calling at a lower level,
Okay.
would I say, and basic disrespect in
Okay.
that.
But in this high conflict column, I notice at the bottom you still have balance of power in the relationship.
Yes, that neither party has more power than the other in the relationship, that they both they're not afraid of each other. That they both believe that they have power in the relationship and they both might have power in the relationship. That out of balance power relationships tend to be more present in domestic violence relationships.
Okay. All right. So in this high conflict column, this is still not considered abusive?
Well, it could be. It's not healthy. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
It's not healthy. And there's controversy about whether that would be domestic violence. But for the most part, I would say it's more a mutually disrespectful relationship where the friendship has eroded. And there's no goodwill, or not much goodwill in that family.
All right. Okay, so let's move on to the third column you have for abuse. So
What-
tell us what this means.
Well, what I did was to look at a range of domestically violent relationships. And abusive relationships are at the lower level of that range. But when I say that, I don't necessarily mean in the lower level of fear. I mean in the lower level of behaviors and what happens. So when I'm talking about abusive relationships, I'm looking at relationships where there's physical aggression, but there's usually longer periods of time between physically aggressive episodes. So there's a period of recovery. You could have 6 months, a year, whatever, between episodes. The episodes tend to be kind of short-lived. If they're yelling at each other, it tends to be not a long period of time where they're yelling at each other, and they tend to do more cussing or generic kinds of name-calling than they do character assassination. They're not character assassinating each other.
Ms. LaViolette, can you explain to us the difference between name calling and character assassination?
Yeah, name-calling, is it okay to swear? I mean, is it okay to say the names? I don't know.
Judge, is that okay? Yes. Okay.
Calling somebody a bitch, calling somebody a bastard would be more name-calling, cussing at somebody. Character assassination goes to tearing apart the character of the person, calling them a whore, calling them a slut, telling them they're ugly, telling them they're fat, telling them that nobody likes them or cares about them, that they're not worth anything. It's tearing apart the character of the person, which when I work with battered women, they say is some of the more difficult, and I've worked with some male victims as well, few, but it's the thing that really rips at their hearts. It's the tearing apart of who they are as a person.
Okay. And so in this third column under abuse, we see name calling but not character assassination yet.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
And then verbal abuse but not psychological. What's the difference?
Well, in a way, it's splitting hairs, and what I mean is that kind of name-calling or cussing, that sort of thing. I remember one of the men that I worked with who came in who said, I came home to my family and nobody was there, and they left me a note to call you, and I don't understand because I've never done anything physically abusive to anybody in my family. And I said, well, what do you do when you get upset? What do you do when you get angry? And he said, well, I yell. And I said, what kinds of things do you yell? He said, well, I scream and I curse and I, call them names and stuff. And I said, well, what else do you do when you're angry? I said, do you ever hit things or throw things? He said, yeah, I punch holes in the wall sometimes and I hit things. But I've never hit anybody in my family. And it took a while for him to understand that the family was sort of living, walking on eggshells about wondering what would happen when he got angry. What's going to happen when he gets angry? What's he going to do and how far is he going to go? And, what they said was, or what he said, well, they should know I wouldn't do this, but they don't know that. They're not sure how far it's going to go. So they live in sort of that walking on eggshells apprehension.
Okay. And incidentally, part of the treatment that you do with men's groups is that working with somebody to understand how their actions affect other people?
Absolutely. We do a lot with empathy in our groups. And we actually look, because most of the men that we work with have come from families where they've been exposed to domestic violence or exposed to violence and abuse. And so I think they're adult victims of childhood abuse myself. And so we're doing, like, one of the things that I might do with them is to ask them to think about a time in their lives where they felt powerless or afraid prior to the age of 10, because they can begin to look back at their childhoods and then to think about what the situation was, to talk about the situation, to talk about who they had that they could talk to about it. Did they have a safe adult that they could talk to, or a safe family member that they could talk to, and who they avoided telling, and who they blamed, because a lot of people blame themselves for being victimized. And then what was the situation ever resolved? Because if it wasn't resolved and there wasn't a way to resolve it, it's hard to get over it. And then how they feel when they talk about it now. Because part of that is looking at how long the effects of victimization are on people, so that they can look back to 10 and they can still feel things when they're 40 years old or 30 years old or 50 years old or 60 years old. They still have feelings about that. And it helps them to understand what it would be like for their family members, what it must be like for them to feel the way they felt. Because once you understand how you feel, it's easier to understand how someone else feels.
All right. And in this column, back to your column with abuse, we still have may be remorseful.
Yeah, actually, they tend to be remorseful. They tend to still be sorry because they have less entrenched belief systems that violence or aggression is a good way to handle things. When you start looking at battering and terrorism, you're looking at people who have a belief system that it's okay or that it's appropriate to solve problems with violence or aggression. And the other thing I would just say with the threats,
The threats of abandonment?
yeah.
Okay.
A lot of people talk about people threatening to kill, threatening a lot of things. But when people are more abusive, they tend to threaten abandonment. They tend to threaten to leave the other person, to maybe, if there are children, to take kids or to take money, that sort of thing. But they tend not to threaten to harm or kill.
Okay. And the last one, aggression takes place without witnesses.
For the most part, in these relationships, and this would kind of compare with Holdsworth, Monroe, and Stewart's category of family only, they occur within the family. And these people, many of them are very well thought of in the community. They're very well appreciated because it would surprise anybody to think that this person was acting out at all. It would throw people off. And so they're more concerned with how they appear to other people. So there is, one of the things about working with folks when they come in and they need to be in a program, or they feel that they need to be in a program, is that they can be pretty motivated to change because they don't want people to know, they don't want to lose their jobs, that sort of thing.
Okay. All right. And so then we would move on next to the battering column.
Right.
All right. And what's the change in that? What do we see?
Generally, more frequent physical violence in that category. Generally, more controlling behaviors. Jealousy is a controlling behavior where people get jealous and they don't want the other person to spend time with. For instance, if it's a male-female relationship, if the male were the victim, the female doesn't want him to spend time with other women, or if it's a male perpetrator, doesn't want the victim to spend time, even with family members, because oftentimes they're coming from a place, I sort of think of it as deprivation mentality, that there's not enough love to go around, and that if you give it to this person, then I don't have any of it. So that kind of thing.
Is that what the perpetrator is thinking?
That's what where the perpetrator would be coming from.
Okay.
So there's generally more frequent physical abuse. There's generally more frequent verbal abuse.
And when you speak of frequent, can you give us an idea, what do you mean by frequent? I mean, you had said earlier that the times between physical aggression could be up 6 months to a year when you were talking about, I think, high conflict.
When I was talking about abuse. actually.
Oh, abuse, I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So what, when you're talking about more frequent, what do you see?
You know, it's different because one of the things is when you're looking at verbal and emotional abuse, it tends to occur much more frequently, so it can occur weekly, it can occur monthly, because the results of having somebody that you love say something really egregious to you sticks with you. It feels bad, and it stays with you for a while. But it can escalate, and it depends on the relationship. Every relationship's different, and the characteristics in that relationship are different. But you can have cases where they'll tell you it's happening almost daily. That's more unusual. But it doesn't have to happen that frequently to feel like it's happening that frequently. I think of people who are depressed, and I use this analogy sometimes that depression is called the common cold of mental illness because most people have had a depressed period of time. And if you're depressed, you can have good days during that period of time, but if somebody asked you how you felt, you'd say, I was depressed. Well, that's the same kind of, it's the establishment of a mood in a relationship, so it doesn't have to happen every day to create a mood. So it could happen every 2 months. It really depends on the nature of what's being said, the nature of what's being done, and how the person receives that.
So is what you're telling us that there's no magical number of frequency before you can determine whether or not a relationship is abusive?
No, there's no magical number.
Okay. All right. And so, okay, back to battering. You were talking about what we see, that we see more frequent type of physical aggression. What else do we see?
You can see more public physical aggression. I've had people, there was a man in my group, we called him the drive-by fruiter because he carried literally raw fruit in his car, and when he had road rage, he would peg people. You know, we've had people that pull people off the freeway, run them off the road. We have people that walk through the mall and they don't like the way you look at them, and they wind up acting out.
And how is that related to domestic violence, though, when you're talking about people acting out on aggression to other people that are not in their own family?
Well, they're also acting out to people in their own family.
Okay.
But the other way of looking at that is vicarious trauma. So if I'm in relationship with somebody who's doing things to other people that are violent, it affects how I feel about my own safety. So if I, for instance, see my partner kick the side of a car in, which is an actual case, then I wonder what that partner's going to do to me, even if they haven't done something to me at that point.
Okay. Okay. All right. So you see, so this type of aggression. What else do you see?
You tend to see more controlling kinds of behaviors. That might be calling during the day to see if you're at work, or texting you a lot so that I know where you are. Could include those kinds of things. And you tend to see a change in the name calling. It tends to sort of slide into the character assassination, into calling the person names, tearing their character apart. There also generally is sexual abuse that does not have to be, it does not have to be forceful, but it has to be coercive psychologically or some way. In other words, the person feels like they should participate in it. That could be an example.
You mean the victim of the relationship would
Yes.
have to feel like they
Yeah.
should
Yeah.
submit to some type of sexual acts?
Yeah, you know, when they really may or may not want to, but they may feel like they need to keep the relationship intact. That can be part of it.
Okay. You talked about controlling and calling somebody or texting somebody throughout the day or a couple times to see where they are. What about looking at people's, what we have now these days, Facebook and MySpace and Twitter accounts, looking them up and seeing what they're up to?
See, that's absolutely true. I don't think that way because it's not my generation, and I don't tweet or text or anything, but I've got clients where that's part of what's happening. GPS stalking, we've seen more of, but that tends to be the more controlling behaviors tend to be in terrorism, but they also can be in battering, where you're looking at people using different ways to control people. So emails, texts, tweets. We've had people GPS stalk their, partners, that kind of thing.
All right. And jealousy, you talked a little bit, you started to talk about jealousy. What is it about jealousy? You said it's a controlling behavior. How is jealousy controlling?
Well, if you're dealing with someone who's jealous, what happens is they let you know in lots of ways that they are. And they don't have to be in obvious ways like saying, I don't want you to see so-and-so. They can be in ways that I give you the silent treatment when you come home after you've spent time with friends, and I don't talk to you for a while. Or I ask you a lot of questions, I interrogate you. And I'm talking about people I've actually worked with. These are things that they've said that they've done. Where they are texting the person during lunch so that they know where they are, so that they're not really leaving their desk, or they're calling them at home and saying, I hope you're home so I can call you. They can be in subtle, less obvious ways.
Okay. And with when you talk about jealousy, is it always jealousy of other people? So if we're talking about a man and a woman, and the man is saying to the woman, you're saying that the man is jealous. You talked about being interrogated or questioned about when the woman goes out with her friends. How is that jealousy when we're talking about maybe if she's going out with girlfriends?
That comes from, I think, the place of that deprivation, which is there's not enough love to go around. So if you're spending time with other people, you're taking it away from me, as opposed to you can spend time with other people and it actually can enhance our relationship. It's more, you're taking it away from me, and you're enjoying these things with other people, so it becomes threatening. Just that you're enjoying time with other people can be threatening.
Threatening to the abusive perpetrator. Okay. And you say putting down friends and family. What does that mean?
It can be talking about put downs of other people's their family and friends, like saying your family's gets in our way, they butt in, your family's stupid, your family, and it's usually not that obvious, by the way, at the beginning. People usually work up to this. It doesn't start there. But the whole notion of saying, your friend so-and-so said something about you. It can be something like that. Or I wonder if so-and-so's a good friend because they did this or they did that. Or your family's hardly ever there for you. Or, those kind of things where you sort of create a wedge between the person and their family, or you create a way of looking at the family, that sort of thing.
Okay. So it's not always, you're saying that it doesn't always start as calling the family members names necessarily?
No. It usually, when you're looking at domestic violence, there's an escalation over time in intensity and frequency. So you don't see things generally real drastically at first. Occasionally, you'll see a very drastic episode. I remember one of the very first women at the battered women's shelter, and she was in the relationship for a while, but the first physical act was so intense that she said she saw stars, and she said, I knew that he could always do that. So he never had to do anything that serious again because I knew it was possible. For people who haven't had that kind of serious thing done, they anticipate that something more serious could happen.
Okay. What about destruction of property? Is that something you see more of in the battering column then?
Destruction of property happens in abuse and in battering, but it tends to be more extensive as you go across the continuum. So where you might see somebody punch a hole in the wall or kick a piece of furniture or, something like that in an abusive situation, as you move across the continuum, you can see something more extreme. One of the men in my group destroyed his wife's $25,000 crystal collection. That took some time. So what you see is the energy the rage that goes over time that can create that can be pretty terrifying, that can create that kind of sort of physical rant, if you will.
And part of destroying that property is, in that particular example, is that because it's directed to something that is hers.
That can happen, and it can happen to something that isn't particularly important to the person either. But absolutely, you see more direction. I remember one of the fellows ripped, his wife was a gardener, and ripped all the plants out of, and I worked with a woman who's, they were both professional people, and he had very expensive suits, and she cut his suits up so that there's this destruction of something that is of value. You see more of that as you move across the continuum.
Okay. And what does self-absorbed, how does that refer to in this column?
Well, it's sort of looking at the world as it affects me. It's not being able to empathize very much. So I see the world as it affects me. So if I hurt you, what I'm concerned about is that you'll leave and that I'll be without you, as opposed to that you're hurt.
Okay. And we see the sexual abuse again. Is that the same?
The sexual abuse, it can be more forceful. It can be more forceful. It doesn't have to be, but it can be more physically forceful.
Okay. And what do you mean by change in victim's personality?
When you go further across the continuum, what you see is that the victim can have a personality before they start. They can be friendly, they can be more self-confident, they can be even, gregarious, they can be the person that plans activities for the friends. And then over time, what happens is they become more withdrawn, they become less self-confident, they become more self-blaming, their self-esteem goes down. So you see a real change. So you can see somebody who's totally gregarious become withdrawn and isolated. You see, that kind of a change.
And timeline, and when we're talking about time, is this something that you're going to see in 2 months, or what kind of time are you talking about?
It really depends on what happens in the relationship. You can't just give that a timeline either, but it usually occurs over a period of time. I would say, I can't even say. I was trying to say, but I really can't say what that timeline is. But it doesn't, depending on what the other person does and depending on where the victim is when they get in the relationship and how vulnerable they are when they get in the relationship, they can be easier to intimidate and change their personality. That can happen more quickly, but it takes a period of time for that to happen, and it takes a context for it to happen.
Okay, so is it more like there's no magic number again to be able to discuss timelines when you can expect to see certain things on this continuum?
No, there's no magic number that I've ever seen or known about or had anybody in the field talk about, ever. A magic number with physical abuse or emotional abuse.
Okay. All right, and then at the end you say more generally violent.
And that's what I meant by that they can be violent in the outside. So there can be a lot of road rage that takes off the form of, pulling somebody off the freeway. It can be bar fights. It can be more violence that they're not so concerned about being public about.
Okay, that the perpetrator isn't concerned.
Right.
Okay. All right, and into the last column we see with terrorism. What do you mean by terrorism? There's battering, we have abuse, battering, and terrorism.
Well, as you go across the continuum, one of the reasons I took out patriarchal terrorism that Johnson had was in case we were dealing with female perpetrators that were doing some of these things, then we would be able to also look at female perpetrators as well. Gay, lesbian relationships. In terrorism, as you move across the continuum, things just get more extreme. So you see usually more intensity in what's happening. And I have stalking up there, and When I'm talking about abuse and lower-end battering, I talk about normal stalking. And people wonder what normal stalking is.
What
But
is
what I
normal
mean by
stalking?
normal stalking is when a relationship ends, most people aren't ready to have, there's usually one person who isn't ready to have it end. And that's for any of us. Most of us have had relationships where they ended before we were ready to have them end. We've had at least one. And you're not quite ready to have it end, so you might call the other person just to hear their little voice on the answer machine, or you might drive by their house or something to see if they're there. You might show up somewhere where you think they are. And people who are domestically abusive or live in domestically abusive relationships don't believe each other. I don't, if I'm perpetrating domestic violence, I don't believe you're going to leave me, and you don't believe I'm going to stop hurting you. So there's a period of time where that person is used to pushing and getting what they want. And they push and they get what they want. So that's what happens. They continue to do that. So what I've seen, and most of us talk about, is that violating protective orders is very common in domestically abusive relationships because they don't believe that you really mean it. And so they're going to keep pushing to see if that changes. And over time, once they know their partners mean business, that stalking behavior decreases. When you're dealing with a terrorist, once they know you mean business, the stalking increases if they're going to stalk. So they become more, sort of aggressive in their stalking behavior.
Okay. And the monopolization of perception, and actually we had that on battering. I don't think we explained it. What is it?
The monopolization of perception is a precursor to the hostage syndrome, but
What does that mean?
what?
Well, okay, you said it's a precursor to the hostage syndrome.
Well, I can kind of give an example of what it is.
Okay.
It's basically a situation where you stop having the ability to see the world through your eyes, and you see it through the eyes of the person who has more power in the relationship. So, for instance, I was working with a couple, and I usually do a basic social interview with this, and I assess for levels of power difference, because levels of power difference are very important in domestically violent relationships. And so I ask who wants to come in first. I speak to each person separately so I can hear sort of the story and the new revised edition of the story. I want to know what's going on from both people's perspective. And he said, why don't you go in first? So she came in first. And I asked her some questions. I found out that there was a 20-year age gap between the two of them, and age is power. Age has power associated with it. And I found out that she had just gotten out of med school, and he had been a doctor for a while, so she had student loans and he had money. Money is power. He was her first sexual experience. That's sexuality is power. And he was her supervisor in med school. So there are a lot of power differences in this couple. And I like to assess for isolation, and what I mean by that is a person's ability to function in the world with other people. And so I found out from her that her friends and family still lived in the area, and she'd gone to high school and college and med school in the same area. So I asked her if her and her partner had gotten together or got together with her friends, and she said no, that they didn't. He wasn't real comfortable with that. And I understood that because of the age difference. I thought that might be not a really fun thing to do. And I said, but what about you? Do you get together with your friends? And she said, well, he's not real comfortable with that either. And I said, well, what about your family? I know you've been close to your parents. Do you get together with your parents? And she said, well, he thinks my family's kind of intrusive and he doesn't want to spend a lot of time with them. And I said, well, what about you? I know you used to go to family dinners. Do you go to your family dinners on Sunday nights? And she said, well, he's not real comfortable with that either. And I said, well, how do you know he's not comfortable with that? And she said, well, when I come home, he won't talk to me. And I said, well, for how long? And she said, well, it used to be a few hours, but now it can drag on for days, and it's really uncomfortable. And I said, well, are there other things that would make you think he's uncomfortable? And she said, well, he asked me a lot of questions. And he asked her questions that wind up being like a full-blown interrogation. And so she pulls back and she stops seeing her family. She stops seeing her friends so much. And I said to her, does it make sense to you that somebody you love doesn't want you to spend time with other people that you love? And she said, it didn't used to make sense to me, but now I look at it through his eyes. So she began to see the world through his perspective and stopped seeing it through her own. And that's what I mean by monopolization of perception.
Does that mean that she doesn't, that when people are seeing it through the perpetrator's eyes, does that mean that they tend to not blame the perpetrator for these actions? Do you know what I mean? Like, is she not getting angry with him for him not letting her go see her family and things like that because she's able to see it from a different perspective, from his perspective?
Well, she saw, in this particular case, she saw him as kind of insecure about the relationship. So she thought if she backed off and spent more time with him and gave him the things he wanted, that he would feel more secure and that they would have, then it would change. So she believed there would be a change created by this.
Okay, okay. All right, and then we see insidious psychological abuse. What do you mean by that?
I mean, in psychological abuse, you can have more controlling behaviors. You can have things that are more subtle. You can have somebody who's putting somebody down in a really insidious way, but not directly necessarily. So you could have somebody, for instance, who you're talking about having just gotten a job, and you're really excited because you just got this job and you were hired on your first interview, and the person says, wow, they must be hiring anybody. And you say, well, that hurts my feelings. That's not what I meant. I mean, why would you say that to me? And they say, that's not what I meant. I meant you got hired so quickly. Of course, you're the best person for the job. That kind of thing. So they wind up shifting your perception a little at a time. So you start thinking, oh, I guess I misinterpreted that. So a lot of things like that. It's sort of mind control in a subtle way, which is actually how you do mind control. It's much more subtle.
Okay. And comments like that, like your example with the job, does that lead to the victim of the relationship, or the woman, whichever? Does that lead to her ultimately thinking that, oh, it's the way I think? Whenever something
right.
goes wrong.
You mean, is she thinking?
This shift of perception.
Oh, the shift in perception. Okay, so what happens is you start seeing it differently and you start thinking, oh, maybe I misinterpreted it. So you start to doubt the way you see things. You start to doubt that your perception is accurate and that maybe you're misperceiving. You know, I didn't get what you meant. So you start doubting the way you look at things.
Okay, okay. And the well-thought-out threat to kill. What do you mean by that?
Well, someone who's battering may threaten to kill you or harm you in some way, but the person, or suicide, that's another threat that's very potent in relationship.
Well, hold on a second. So wait a minute. So we have a well-thought-out threat to kill. So do you mean that it can be a threat to kill themselves?
It can be a threat to kill themselves, too.
Okay. All right, let's talk about
but
that.
the battering would be less well thought out. It would be more like, I'm telling you I'm going to kill myself. I'm telling you I'm going to kill you. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt somebody you love, something like that. The well thought out, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to do it, or I'm going to be more specific with that.
Okay. And how is that terrorism? I mean, when they're talking about killing themselves, not killing the other person, how does that relate to abuse and terrorism?
If you're with somebody you love and they threaten to kill themselves, it is terrorizing to people who love you. It's terrorizing to anybody in that family. It's terrorizing to children in that family. It's when you talk to families where the threats of suicide, it can control the entire family because they're so worried that could happen. And I think it's something, I see when I work with parents and they have teenagers, and the teenager is acting strange, and they're afraid that the teenager is going to hurt themselves, and the teenager hasn't even threatened it. But because a parent believes it could happen, they are terrorized by that.
All right, and you said it controls the family. How does it control the family?
Because your focus shifts from everybody else to the person who's suicidal, or that you believe is suicidal, or that you believe is homicidal. In a family where there's domestic violence, the focus is more often on the perpetrator from everybody in the family, because you have to be careful of that person. So your focus is much more on that person. The old saying, you oil the squeaky wheel, and I think that's sort of what happens.
Okay. All right, and you talk about torturing pets. Is that something you see?
I've seen that. I haven't seen that much, partially because I think people who do things to animals are reluctant to talk about them. So there are many things that are not talked about. I actually had a young man who was a very bright graduate student at UCLA, very handsome, very just charismatic guy, who came into group one night and said, and he was crying, and he said, "I kicked my puppy to death." And it was horrible. And it was horrible for all of us. And he admitted to it because he said, "I need help. I have to have help." But it's very hard to talk about hurting children and about hurting or doing anything that you think is would be considered strange. So, any kind of strange psychological abuse or that sort of thing, it's hard for people to talk about that in group. They might talk to you about it afterwards. They might talk to you about it during an intake session, or they might wait to know you. I'm working with a young man right now who said, "Alice, I know some things that are causing me problems, but I'm not going to tell you because I don't know you right now." And I said, "That's fine. I don't expect you to tell me things until you have some reason to trust me."
All right. Let's see. And then we have extreme isolation.
Isolation allows somebody to do mind control. And isolation can take a lot of forms. Isolation doesn't have to be as obvious as you never get to see anybody that you care about. Isolation can be that you're not talking to anybody about what's going on in your life. And that's common in domestically violent relationships, that people don't talk to other people. They don't talk to their friends. They don't talk to their family about what's going on, because they want people to like their partner. They want people to care about them. They want people to hang around with. They don't want anybody to think they have lousy taste. They care about that. So they tend to keep it to themselves. That's a form of isolation. Looking at what people write and telling them they can't write certain things or that they can't say certain things is a form of isolation. And then there are real obvious forms like taking the spark plug. I don't even know if cars have spark plugs anymore, actually, but dismantling the car so that somebody can't use the car, or taking the keys away, or there are lots of ways to isolate people.
So can a person be isolated in, what I'm hearing you say is that a person can be isolated even though it's not necessarily an extreme situation like dismantling the car?
Yes.
And when can a person be isolated just because they have no one else to talk to about what happens?
That's really the main reason they are isolated, because they stop talking to anybody else, and so the ability to put things in perspective becomes lost in that relationship. So whether you're male or female, if you're in a situation and you can't talk to anyone else, then the reality of the person you're with, that whatever they tell you becomes more real because you don't have another mirror to look into. So I've had, for instance, I had 2 women come into the shelter in the same week who both believed that they were ugly and overweight, and they were both very thin and attractive. And they believed that because they had been told that so often, and they were pretty isolated. So you can believe what the person tells you more easily if you're isolated.
Can you tell the difference, though, when a woman chooses to not tell other people? Like, if she has family and she just doesn't tell them what's going on, or she has friends and she just chooses not to tell them, is there a choice in the matter where she's choosing to isolate herself, or is that part of a psychological or something that happens in an abusive relationship where it's not really her choice?
Well, I don't think that a victim of domestic violence feels that they have a choice.
Okay.
I think that what happens is your choices get narrowed, your world gets narrower. That your choices about how you handle things get narrower because you're concerned. You know, I see over and over again that people I'm with are very concerned about the reputation of the partner that they have. They're concerned about, if it's a school teacher, they're concerned about that school teacher losing their job if anybody finds out. They're worried about a reputation that somebody has. I always remember a woman who called anonymously on the hotline, and she was married to a minister who was local, apparently, and I don't know who it was. I never knew who it was, but she called the hotline and said, "Nobody will believe me, and I can't ruin his reputation. He's very good with people in the church, so I don't want to ruin his reputation." And I hear that over and over again. Even people who own their own businesses, they don't want them to lose work. Police officers, people in the military, there's a lot of concern from victims across the board that the person they're with is going to have a marred reputation or lose their career behind, or their standing.
And so does that factor into the feeling of a victim feeling like she doesn't have a choice to talk to other people?
Yes, it absolutely factors in. Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about balance of power, and I know in the first two columns we see that there is a balance of power in the relationship, and then that seems to disappear, starting with abuse. What is the importance of that?
Well, the balance of power means that there's, pretty much positive regard for each other, that we like each other, that I value your opinion in my relationship. I want to hear what you have to say about it. When we, buy things, we kind of talk about them unless they're your things, But that, we value, we make decisions. If we have children, we talk about how we're going to discipline them, or we try to work together or try to figure out a way to do that even if we aren't sure how to do it. But when you look at a shift, you begin to see that the person who perpetrates has more power because the other person has given up so much of who they are that they lose the ability to have that balance of power. And I don't think it's always thought out. I don't think people necessarily who are perpetrating domestic violence are consciously saying, "I'm going to take your power away. I'm going to," I don't think they're just necessarily doing that at all. I think they're more reflexive. I think it's more an emotional reflex that they're, for them it feels more like survival. How am I going to survive? And they act out. The ones that are terrorists and high-end battering, they're more thoughtful about what they do.
Okay. The last thing we had on there, not last actually, the generally more regular physical abuse but may occur without physical.
Right. So, you can have a terrorist who never lays a hand on anybody. And I worked on a murder case in the late 90s with a woman who was had been very financially successful. And the way her family started to notice that things were not right was that she went to them and started asking to borrow money. She was pregnant. Her partner wouldn't go to appointments with her, and when she thought she was having contractions, wouldn't go to the doctor with her. When they went out with other people, there was an occasion where he kicked the side of a car in front of her and in front of the other people because he didn't, he got furious. There was an occasion where he chased a guy on a bike and beat him up in front of this person who's a rugby player. When she separated from him, they had a child at that time. When they separated, she went and moved in with her parents. Her father and mother were in their 70s. And he began to call the Department of Children and Family Services and make anonymous phone calls that that there was child abuse. And so social workers would come out to investigate. They were never substantiated, but there were so many calls that they came out one night and were going to remove the child from the home because of these threats. And the social worker was the one who said to this family, you know, this is a battering relationship. They had no idea because they watch television and they know that if you're battered, you're carried out on a stretcher. They didn't think that this was abusive behavior, and he was stalking, and he was making threats, calling and leaving messages, I'm going to be your worst nightmare. And then when he had custody of his little boy, he would take him to the hospital and force them to, you know, say that something was wrong and force them to do tests on this little child. And so the father, her father, who had been a prisoner of war during World War II, developed post-traumatic stress. And he was also told by the doctor that if he didn't do something, that his wife was going to have a heart attack and die. And he wound up emptying a gun into this man. And he said, I'm giving my life for my daughter. But he was in a fugue when he did it. But his neighbors, he did it in his neighborhood. And he walked down the street, and his neighbors who'd known him for 25 years looked at him and said, they said it was like he was sleepwalking. He didn't know what he was doing. He just walked down the street, and he didn't know what he was doing. He was so terrified about what was happening that, you know, he reacted.
So that's something where somebody was terrorizing someone else without any physical abuse?
No physical abuse in that case.
You also have sexual humiliation and degradation. What do you see with that?
Sexual humiliation is where you're having people do things that they might go along with, but lowers their self-esteem. And it can be any kind of thing that's humiliating or degrading to someone in a sexual way, or using sex as a way to control. So it could be anything. It could be something that the other person isn't comfortable with, they go along with. It could be forcing somebody to be sexual, and there are strange things that happen in that area. We're less likely to get information on that area because I find that victims of domestic violence do not like to talk about sexual abuse because they feel that they're as responsible as the other person. They sound a lot like folks I work with who are incest survivors, that they blame themselves and they hold themselves accountable for the sexual abuse. So they don't, there's a lot of shame and they don't talk about it much. It's the area we get the least information on, I would say.
Okay. All right, and I see at the top of the continuum you talk about exacerbating factors. What are those? What does that mean?
Those are all areas that can take somebody from one part of the continuum to the other. They're factors that can exacerbate behaviors. The first one, the family of origin issues, have to deal with what kind of family you grow up in. And was there violence in that family? Was there psychological, physical abuse, sexual abuse in that family, neglect in that family? What kinds of things did you witness as a child? And how deep does that go? Did you have multiple family members involved in that violence? That sort of thing. So you're looking at how far back you can take violence in that family of origin, but also the quality of the violence that occurs, you know, in the context.
What does that do if somebody comes from their original family of origin that has the things that you're discussing of violence or neglect, things like that? What does that mean with regard to this continuum or domestic violence?
Well, it ups the ante.
Okay.
Because you have, in general, less ability to handle things. I don't expect people who come from a monolingual family, a Spanish-speaking family or an English-speaking family, to speak fluent if they come from an English-speaking family, to speak fluent Spanish, or Spanish-speaking family to speak fluent English, because there's not exposure to it in a monolingual family. I don't expect people who come from violent households to speak the language of mental health, because they haven't learned it. And so they have to have somebody, you know, I tell a lot of the folks I work with that this is just school. You're going to school to learn some things that you didn't learn when you're growing up. And this can help you in terms of being able to handle situations when you feel powerless. It's almost, when you look at family of origin, there's like emotional reflexiveness. It's that you act, you react as opposed to respond. You don't think as much as you react in that situation.
All right, and there's previous abusive relationships?
What I look at with that is, has this person been involved in other situations where they have had abusive relationships, and has there been an escalation? So, for instance, if they've been physically aggressive in the relationship that I'm working with, do they punch or have multiple attacks or whatever, and did they earlier on just hit or slap, because there tends to be an escalation over time. If they were verbally abusive or psychologically abusive, has that increased over time? Because unless there's intervention, it tends to. It doesn't always, but it tends to. So I look at
So you
the
look-
history of abuse with the perpetrator.
The history of abuse that the perpetrator has done to other people?
Yes, has done to other people. And the exacerbating factors are all about looking at the perpetrator.
Okay, okay. And what are the other ones?
Substance abuse, when we look at substance abuse, substances are disinhibitors, so somebody's can be more likely to act out if there's a substance, but we find that about 40 to 60% of the people that we've worked with have had some issue with domestic violence when they've been using, but about 40 to 60% haven't. So the other thing to look at with substance abuse is that the first year is not really about recovery. The first year is focused on not doing the bad thing, which is why you hear people in 12-step programs say, I'm in 12-step program for the rest of my life or for a very long time, and I go to meetings every week or I go to several a week, because what they know is that they continue to change and grow if they stay with that program. They continue to learn things that they didn't learn before. So I look at the first year as being problematic too, because when you're dealing with domestic violence, if you're also dealing with substances, that person is now a domestic violence perpetrator without an anesthetic. So it can be a dangerous time. So we look at not only the current use, but have they recently stopped using?
Okay. And psychological issues?
Psychological issues can be all kinds of things. They can be whether somebody's, occasionally we have somebody who's diagnosed as bipolar in group. Are they on their medication or not? Generally, you don't have people who are long-term using psychological, psychotropic drugs are not in our group because they can't function as well in a group. So when we're working in group, we have to look at people's ability to function in that group so that the group's effective for them.
Okay. All right. Does that explain your continuum and how you've used it?
I think it does.
All right. Judge, now might be a good time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will take the noon recess. Please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice lunch. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
We are at recess. Thank you. Please be seated. Ms. LaViolette, please come forward.
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You may continue.
Thank you. Ms. LaViolette, just before we finish talking about the continuum, and this is Exhibit 558, have you ever used this in court before?
Yes, I've used it in family court primarily because there was a perception that there was a flight risk with a father who had dual passports, and he didn't fit into what is commonly seen as a perpetrator. He wasn't like this, the guy on television or the guy in the movies, but he clearly fit in to somewhere between some of the characteristics of abuse and some of the characteristics of battering. So it was used to explain to the court what that range of behavior could look like.
Well, and when you talk about range of behavior, when you're looking at a potential batterer or a potential abuser, perpetrator, is it possible for them to have characteristics of more than one of these columns?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They can. That's why it's a continuum, because there can be behaviors from different categories that are present in one person.
All right. And ultimately, after you created this continuum, was it ever published anywhere?
It was published in the Journal of Child Custody, which is a peer-reviewed journal that means that other people that in your profession are asked to look at it and review it and decide whether it's worthy of publication or not.
So when something's peer-reviewed, does that mean those people who are looking at it, do they have the ability to say, no, it's not worthy?
Yes, they do. In fact, I'm a peer reviewer for the Journal of Child Custody, and sometimes we get an article that we just don't think is up to standard, and you can either recommend that people rewrite it if there are minor changes, or you can recommend that it not be published at all, and so that happens.
Okay. And this morning when we're talking about this continuum, and you're talking about the batterers or the perpetrators, you talk about them having control over their family members or the fear that they can instill in the family. When you talk about family, who are you talking about?
I'm not necessarily talking about family in the standard kind of way, because it can be people who very much care about them. So they don't have to be living with that person, they don't have to be married to that person, but they need to be intimate enough that that person really cares about them.
And is there a correlation in the work that you've done between people who, the type of abuse or the more serious of abuse that can occur with the type of relationship between the abuser and the victim?
Generally speaking, in intimate partner violence, most of the rage is directed at the intimate partner, but it can also be directed at children as well if there are children involved. Otherwise, it tends to be directed at the safest target, and that tends to be the intimate partner, adult partner.
Why is the intimate partner a safe target?
Because the intimate partner is probably not going to tell anybody about it, and the intimate partner has, if they're married, they've made a promise to stay. If they're not married, they've probably made some kind of a commitment in terms of just loving each other. And because people are generally more cautious when there are logical consequences and witnesses, which is why you don't see a lot of people who are perpetrating domestic violence are not acting out at the workplace. Because if they act out at the workplace, there are witnesses and there are logical consequences right away. And when you're at home, there might be the consequence that your partner gets upset with you, but generally it takes a lot longer time before your partner would leave, or there would be a logical consequence like the police coming or something like that. And there are no witnesses other than the people that you're intimate with.
Okay. You talked about intimate partner violence. Is that, I don't know if you've used that term yet, but is that somehow different than domestic violence?
Actually, intimate partner violence is the new terminology because it covers people that aren't married. And when you talk about family violence or domestic violence, sometimes people think you're talking about child abuse as well. So they've kind of called it intimate partner violence now.
Is that the new terminology?
That's the new one, yeah.
Okay. All right. There's a lot to be said about intimate partner violence where one partner will stay. And it rises, I'm sure the answer to that is something long, and I don't want to go there yet, but my question is can you walk us through a domestic violence relationship? I mean, how does it start?
Well, I use this kind of example when I'm doing training because the question I'm still asked the most is why does someone stay in an abusive relationship? So what I try to do is make it something that we can all get because most of us would fit in this kind of a situation. So I usually walk people through, I ask people to think about the very first time they were in love, the first time they were really seriously involved with somebody. And usually that's late teens, early 20s, in the 20s sometime. And I ask them to think about what that's like for them and where they learned about being in love. I ask them to think about what they saw in their own families, what they've seen on television, what they've seen in the movies, what books they've read. For some of us, we can go back to the radio, what we heard on the radio. So to look at this range of places that we get information. And so I ask people to think about that. And then I ask them to put themselves in their first relationship and what that was like for them. And I tell them, I have a couple theories about relationship, and one of them is that most of us could live with someone who was abusive for about a year, and we could live with them. And if we were in love, we wouldn't notice because they would be on their best behavior for a period of time. And the energy of new love is bigger than the energy of fear. And for a lot of people who are abusive, they're really coming from a place of fear even more than rage, and the rage kind of covers that up. So I talk about that a little bit, and then I ask them to think about being in this relationship and spending time with this person and going out on dates and meeting each other's friends and maybe eventually meeting each other's family and having some holidays together. And then this person that you love gets angry at you and gives you the silent treatment for a day or two. And you're kind of wondering what's going on. And you're a little nervous. And then that person calls you back like nothing's happened and you're fine. And then you go a little further into the relationship and the person gets angry at you and calls you some names that you find really offensive and you're upset with. And then I ask people, do you think you would leave at this point when a person calls you these names that you don't like? What do you think you would do? Do you think you would leave? And most people say no. And so I ask them to go a little further in the relationship. And now you decide that you're really serious about each other, so you're spending more time together. And as you're spending more time together, some other things happen. And you get in an argument, and this argument's a little different than the other arguments that you've had. And during this argument, your partner picks up something that you care about and throws it into the wall and breaks it. And I ask people, would you leave now? And most people say no. And by the way, it hasn't mattered what group I've spoken to. I speak to all kinds of groups. I speak to church groups and professional organizations and probation officers and therapists, and it doesn't seem to matter. It's pretty consistent.
Okay.
And then I go a little further, and I say, now you've been together, and maybe you've been together about 1.5 years or 2, and maybe you decide you're going to live together, or maybe you decide that you're just going to keep seeing each other, and you're really tight with each other. And you have an argument this time that's different than any of the other arguments that you've had. And in this argument, your partner slaps you across the face. Now, you're very involved in this relationship, and you love this person. Do you think you're going to stop loving and liking somebody because they hit you? And most people say no, that is not true for them. And they think about getting angry, and they get upset. And I said, how do you feel when somebody does that to you? And people are upset, and most people believe that in a relationship they should be treated well, that they shouldn't be hitting or being hit, that sort of thing. But they also have a clash of values at the very beginning of that relationship. And the clash of values is, I shouldn't be mistreated, but I should be a forgiving human being. I should be a compassionate human being. I should be an empathetic human being. I should stand behind somebody through thick and thin, which a lot of us believe. If we've made any promises in the relationship, we think about those promises and commitments we've made in the relationship. And what winds up happening is those things tend to weigh more than the thing that says, the value that says I shouldn't be mistreated.
So
And
is
there's-
that, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
is that the ultimate then clash that this person, the victim, for lack of a better term, is that the ultimate, what they're going through, is the feelings of being treated poorly versus being the good person who forgives?
There's that clash very early on. And it's confusing, I think, for any human being, because we all, I believe, come up with the belief that we should be good human beings, and we have standards for that. And those standards are important, those beliefs are important, and I think define who we are. I think that they're significant to us. And so you've got this clash of, different beliefs that are coming together at that point, but there may be more on the being a good person than there are on protecting yourself.
And so when you're having this clash of between these two feelings, is that something that is, in your experience, keeping people staying in the relationship?
It does, particularly at the beginning, because you believe that there's a possibility of change. And there's a concept that Kate Muldery coined back in the 80s called learned hopefulness.
What is that?
Excuse me?
What is that?
Okay. Well, there was a term called learned helplessness that was a psychological kind of experiment. And people thought that victims, and we call them survivors too, that stay in relationship because they feel helpless. They feel like it doesn't matter what they do, that doesn't change what happens to them. So there is that. But one of my colleagues did a really significant piece of research, Ola Barnett, on battered women, and found that the two major reasons they stayed was hope and fear. And that hope was really big. That between episodes, you have time to regroup, you have time to fall back in love with that person or care about that person, your anger goes away, and you have an opportunity to believe that things are going to change. And when that happens, you develop a pattern of hope. And I think what's interesting for me is that that's a good thing for most of us. Hope keeps us, if we're in a position where we've just lost our job, it keeps us in a position to think, well, I'll get another job and I'll be able to support my family, I'll be able to do this and that. So it's a good thing. But in an abusive relationship, it winds up backfiring to a certain degree because it keeps people kind of stuck.
Okay, and you mentioned fear, the other part of the
Yeah,
research?
and fear takes a longer time usually to develop.
Okay. All right. And so you were walking us through where we get to the relationship with, and after all this time now, the person has slapped the other partner.
Yeah.
And in most of in your teachings and in speaking, and in your experience, are people telling you commonly that they wouldn't leave?
They most commonly tell me they wouldn't leave. And people who are in positions that seem powerful, like probation officers and that sort of thing, I've had people come up to me after so many of my speaking engagements. They come up and they say, I don't want anybody to know this. Can I talk to you? And I either give them my card so they can call, or we go in another area and talk, because there's a lot of shame attached to being a woman or a man who has money, who has the ability to leave and doesn't leave, because they're not looking at the emotional reasons that people don't leave.
Well, that brings up a good point. So if somebody has the financial ability to leave, does that mean they're going to leave necessarily?
Not at all. When I worked at the shelter, we saw a lot more women who were, didn't have money and didn't have resources. They might not have had family around to stay with. They may not have had the money to stay in a hotel. And so because there's not a lot of bed space in any given city, you have to sort of sift through people's issues and really prioritize who you're going to take into the shelter. So when women had resources, we might plug them into counseling or something like that, but maybe not take them into the shelter.
But in your experience, did you see women who had resources who would stay?
Right. What would happen is, in the shelter, I saw people with limited resources. When I went out into private practice, I started seeing people with resources and finding that there were a lot of reasons that people stayed that didn't involve finances.
What about couples with children? If there's no children, because we often hear that children is a reason to stay, whether it's right or wrong. So what about couples who don't have children?
Couples that don't have children still have the emotional bond with each other, because that's, right, the most significant adult relationship we have is with our intimate partners. And so that is significant. And we also have belief systems that tend to be a little different for men and women around this, because women tend to still believe that if the relationship fails, they fail. So there's a old piece of research, and I don't even know who did it. It was something that I heard at a substance abuse conference, and I see it as sort of analogous with domestic violence, that women who live with male substance abusers tend to stay in those relationships longer than men who live with female substance abusers, that the men are able to pull away faster than the women. And that tends to still be true based on, kind of societal attitude.
Okay. All right, we started with you walking us through a relationship, a domestic violence relationship. Is that how far you get when you talk about it?
No, I go further than that. I usually go to a place where people are more abused. And I also ask people to think about this. For instance, what would happen if you were in a relationship and you had religious beliefs that said that divorce was wrong, or that you should turn the other cheek and forgive, and that you had a spiritual community that really supported you staying in the relationship? Or what would happen if you were an undocumented immigrant and you had a green card that was dependent on the person who hurt you, or their green card was dependent on you? What would you do? How far would that go? What would happen if you were a community that was marginalized and were afraid to interact with the criminal justice system?
What do you mean?
A community that has bad experiences with the criminal justice system and would be less likely maybe to make contact.
Okay.
What if you were gay or lesbian and had to worry about outing yourself or your partner? And so I take a lot of things that come at people from the outside. What if you're poor and you don't have the money? I always think about one of the first women who came to our shelter, who actually, I think she saved for 6 months unmonitored change to be able to pay for herself and her children to come on the bus from Los Angeles to Long Beach to get into the shelter. So there are all these different kinds of scenarios you can look at and different reasons that make it difficult for people to leave.
Did you, in your experience, have you found, you talked about religion, have you found that to be a big factor in why people don't leave?
I have absolutely found it to be a big factor. There's a wonderful little book called Keeping the Faith by Marie Fortune, who is a woman, a female minister, and also one by Reverend Al Miles, that both talk about the religious community and domestic violence. And I have, one of my first clients in private practice was a woman who came from a community where when she talked about leaving her spouse, was told that she was damning her children's souls and her soul to hell. And she was afraid to leave because of that. She sort of weighed these two, you know, staying in the relationship or damning her soul to hell. And her husband was a probation officer and a deacon in the church. And it wasn't until he choked her in front of the kids that she went to her minister herself and didn't just go to the women's group. And she was talking to her minister, and she was talking as if she was talking about someone else. She was pretty detached from what had happened, because people tend to detach when they're traumatized. And she pulled down her turtleneck, and she had marks around her neck, and talked about being choked into unconsciousness. And it was then her minister supported her and really told her to leave. And that's when she actually felt that she could. And I found that with numbers of people in religious communities, that they need the support of that religious community to be able to leave.
And so in that woman's case, did it take the actual proof of physical abuse to get the permission?
It did in that particular case, yes. It doesn't
And-
always, but it did in that case.
Well, and in your experience, do you often see women who ever have proof of physical abuse?
No. A lot of women have no proof of physical abuse because they haven't reported. When I'm working in family law cases, primarily, you very seldom have evidence because most people don't make police reports. Most people don't, when they go to the doctor. In fact, I had a client a couple of years ago whose boyfriend took her to the hospital because she had, he'd hit her in the head and she had a concussion. And when there's mandatory reporting, when there's an injury, and so when the doctor said to her, I'm going to have to take a report, and left the room, she left the hospital. And that sort of thing happens frequently, where you're not wanting to get your partner in trouble, so you don't make the report, you don't tell anybody, you don't, and you lie about what happened in a medical report. So if you go to the doctor and you've got, you know, you have to have stitches, you say that you fell.
All right. So when you're describing a typical what you might see in a domestic violence relationship, the progression of it, what does isolation have to do with it?
Well, because you're not talking to your friends and family. And by the way, I've heard people say, well, if you have supportive friends and family, you can talk to them. Oftentimes that's not true, because your supportive friends and family might want you to make a decision that you're not ready to leave. They want you to leave, or they want you to, force the person into therapy, or they want you to make a police report, and you're not ready to do it. So the less you talk to other people, the more isolated you get. So it's not necessarily that the perpetrator is intending to isolate you, but that you feel that you can't talk to people about what's going on in your life, and so you don't.
All right. And what happens to these women, what happens to their self-esteem when they're progressing through a relationship like this?
Well, over time, what generally happens is they're crossing their own bottom lines. So things that they believe shouldn't happen to them are happening to them. Things they said this will never happen to me. If this happened to me, I would do this or that. And I think about that. You know, most of us sort of establish bottom lines when we're in junior high school, I think. And those bottom lines, and I think sort of universally with men and women, we have bottom lines about infidelity. That if somebody's unfaithful, we're going to do this or that, or we'd never put up with this or that. But if you read Cosmo and Red Book and some of those things, you find out that lots of people put up with infidelity. And so we cross our bottom lines. With people who are abused, every time they cross their bottom line, it's like another place where they feel terrible about themselves. So as their bottom lines get crossed and they feel worse about themselves, their apprehension is also going up. And
Their apprehension of what? Their fear, right?
Yes,
Fear about what?
fear about what's happening in the relationship. And most of the time, by the way, they don't say they're afraid. When I interview people who are victims of domestic violence, they repeatedly say they're not afraid. And so I ask them, do you get afraid when the person's angry? And then they say yes. But they're not universally afraid unless it's really progressed to a place where the abuse is happening frequently, where the person is so isolated, that sort of thing.
And what does it do? What does it add to a domestic violence relationship when you have one partner with such low self-esteem? If it's continuing to lower, what does that do to the relationship, that, as far as domestic violence is concerned?
Well, here's the thing. Most people get in a relationship and they're attracted to the person where they are. And that's true for people who are abusive as well. So as your self-esteem goes down, you become another person. And usually the person who is mistreating you stops respecting you at all as well. So it is easier to mistreat you. The more your bottom lines sort of collapse, the more I disrespect you, the more I feel justified in being able to hurt you.
So as an example of a bottom line, we might start with that a person would never let another call them names, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yes.
right? Would most people think that that's something they wouldn't allow?
I think most people don't like to be called names.
Okay, so if that's a bottom line, but as you described the relationship and everything that you're putting into this relationship and the time involved and the love that you have for this person, is that something that people allow that bottom line to be crossed by that point?
Yes, and the other thing that's happening is that the longer you're together, the more investment you have in that relationship. And depending, I mean, some people buy things together, some people take trips together. You go on vacations and you have pictures of those trips. That's a very bonding kind of situation. You buy things together. That's a very bonding kind of situation. You're making more of an in-depth commitment to that partner.
Okay, so what about, is there such thing called victim blame?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Victim blame was actually a term coined by Wolfgang, who was a criminologist in the 50s. And what he was looking at was why victims tend to be flaky. And what he meant was, you know, sometimes they won't show up in court, sometimes they won't return calls by, you know, the attorneys who are trying to get information, they won't do interviews, or they change their description of somebody, or they change what they said initially. And he found that we tend to blame victims for their own victimization. And the more, and so if I'm not a victim and you're robbed, and I say, well, gee, you didn't lock your door, so I can blame you for that. I can say, well, she or he didn't lock their door, so it's not going to happen to me. It sort of alleviates my fear because I can lock my door and now I'm not going to get victimized. But it doesn't help victims much. And we find that victims do that. And I use an example. I usually ask people when I'm speaking, has anybody in the room ever been robbed or had their house or car broken into? And there's always at least a few people in LA that have, that's for sure. So I ask them about that. And I ask them, what did the police say when they came out? And they will ask if the door is locked or whatever. And I said, well, the police have to determine the penal code also. But your friends don't. And what do your friends ask you? Well, your friends ask you, is your door locked? Do you have a security system? Did you leave any windows open? That sort of thing. And if you tell your friends that you left your windows open, what do? They go, well, of course, that person, you've seduced that innocent person into your house to steal your best things. And I think people go there, and it's that subtlety of blaming victims that
So
we
no-
hold them accountable.
I was going to say, when you talk about subtlety, so it's not as though they're saying, well, it's your fault that you got robbed because you left your door open. Is it more subtle the way that they ask you questions about your door being open?
It could be more subtle. It could be, depending on your friendship, it could be not subtle at all, but it can also be that that it could be that somebody just shrugs their shoulders or just, looks at you a particular way. So that what you know is you you wouldn't have gotten mugged if you weren't walking out in that bad neighborhood, or that sort of thing.
And how does that apply to a domestic violence relationship?
What most of us in the field have commonly said is that the more intimate the victimization, the more blame is attached to the victim. So, for instance, in sexual assault, we tend to blame the victim.
Tell me, what do you
In
mean?
domestic violence, we blame the victim.
Okay, tell me what you mean with the sexual assault blaming the victim.
We look at provocation, particularly in domestic violence. In sexual assault, we might look at the way somebody's dressed, or who they're hanging out with, or they were drinking, or whatever. We, use that.
In other words, that the person put themselves in that situation?
Yes.
Okay.
In domestic violence, there's a lot of times the issue of provocation. People will say, well, you shouldn't have said this, or you shouldn't have done this, and you're provoking the person. So there's some attachment. There's this cause and effect attachment that if you hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have done this back to you, kind of thing.
So as an example, if a person, if the abusive partner is jealous and the other partner knows that the abusive partner is jealous, are we talking about blame then if the other partner mentions that she went out with someone else, with her friends, knowing that the abusive partner is going to get upset?
That could be seen as it depends on who's looking at it. I mean, I don't see it as provocation,
Right.
but someone who's abusive might see it as provocation.
So the abusive person is the one who'd say, well, look what you made me do?
Yes.
You told me about this?
I always remember, too, the teachers that I worked with who, he was in my program, but he had been in the program for a while, and his wife wanted a session with him. And they both agreed on what happened in this session. And what happened was that he spent a lot of time on his computer, and she would get upset about it. So she walked by him on a Sunday night and said, I don't know why you're playing with your computer. I wish you'd come up and spend some time with me. So he shut his computer down, and he went up to spend time with her. And she looked at him and said, what are you doing up here? You like to spend all that time with your computer. Why don't you go down and play with your computer? And I thought, well, that would irritate me if somebody did that to me. I'd understand being irritated at that. The problem is that he went on and on berating her over and over again, telling her what a terrible person she was, what a terrible wife she was, that nobody liked her at school, that she was a lousy teacher, and just berated her. So in domestic violence, the punishment doesn't really fit the crime.
Okay. Does that also have to do with the batterers externalizing blame?
Yes, that's about externalizing the blame. That's about blaming the other person. And one of the things I ask him is, when would it be okay for your wife to get angry at you? And he said, never. And I said, what happens when she gets angry? Well, it feels like a commentary on his whole person. It's not like she's just mad at him for playing with the computer. It's like calling him, in his eyes, an awful human being, because his self-esteem isn't very good, or her self-esteem, depending on who's being abusive. Their self-esteem isn't very good either. You can't keep hurting people you love and feel good about it.
Is that something that you find in treating men who have been perpetrators of abuse, that about their self-esteem, that it's lower, that it's low?
Yeah, and they may not appear that way at all. They may be very successful, they may be very charismatic, they may have positions of power on the outside, but it's more how you feel on the inside. And it's more how you feel in that intimate situation, because you can feel very powerful anywhere else, but in that intimate situation, you can still feel powerless. Remember one of the psychologists I went to hear speak, John Jolliffe, and he said, I climb those icicles that melt, I climb them, I rock climb, I rappel off mountains, I skydive. I'm doing all that to prepare for the scariest thing in my life, which is a relationship.
What is behavioral self-blame? Is that what we're talking about?
Behavioral self-blame would be, you didn't lock your windows, so I lock your windows. You change your behavior.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part, what you said. You like what?
It's like, I didn't lock my windows.
Oh, okay.
Right? It's like I change what I do. I don't smart mouth you, or I don't get angry back, or if it's something like, locking my windows, I lock my windows. I may blame myself for being victimized. It's not just the outside that blames you. You tend to blame yourself too. I hear people all the time who've gotten robbed, who think, or have gotten mugged, who are blaming themselves, who are saying, what's wrong with me? I can't believe I was that stupid. I left my door unlocked, or I left the keys in my car, that kind of thing. So people feel that way. They blame themselves. So behavioral self-blame is an easier self-blame to deal with, because all I have to do is change my behavior, and when I change my behavior, I start feeling okay again. I think, okay, I've got this one solved.
Do you mean as changing your own behavior versus changing your partner's behavior?
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So it's easier if a person is blaming themselves for getting into this horrible fight where they're being attacked by words and emotional abuse, basically. Is it easier to blame themselves sometimes because they know if I change, maybe if I just didn't provoke them, then it won't happen again?
Yeah.
Is that what victims do?
If they're early enough on, they usually will blame themselves but feel like they can change it. And that's the hope. Okay. The hope is you can change it. The belief is you can change it. And by the way, the perpetrator of domestic violence usually believes they can stop it as well.
That he can stop
behaving
himself.
that way. Yeah, stop behaving that way.
Okay. And that's, you said, to do with the hope? I guess on both sides then?
Yes.
The hope of the man and hope of the woman?
Yeah. And so that's behavioral self-blame. There's another kind of self-blame that's called characterological self-blame.
What is that?
Characterological self-blame is when you stop blaming your behavior and start blaming yourself. So you might say, what did I do to provoke it? But then you say, if I'm really a good person, why am I being treated this way? Maybe I'm not such a good person. Or if I'm smart, if I'm bright, why do I stay in this? So you can blame yourself for staying, you can blame yourself for leaving, you can blame yourself for what's being done to you, because you start to believe that there's something wrong with you, and that's why it's happening.
And when in the progression of a domestic violence relationship does this characterological self-blame happen?
Well, it usually happens after the behavioral self-blame, but once again, there's no magic number with that either.
Okay. And what does that do ultimately to someone who starts to blame themselves, their own character? What does that do to them and their ability to leave?
It makes it very difficult to leave because you don't even think you're worthy. You don't think you're worthy. And I think the other part that's tough is that when you blame yourself, it's harder to ask for help because you're so ashamed. What it does is add to the shame and humiliation. And shame and humiliation will keep people stuck.
In the same place?
Yeah.
Okay. We talked a little bit when we were talking with the continuum. We talked about the monopolization of perception, and you had mentioned something about a precursor to the, what is it? The hostage syndrome.
Right.
What is that?
Well, the hostage syndrome was named after a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. And there was a bank robbery, tellers were held hostage over a period of time, and over this period of time, they developed some characteristics, and later, I think it was 2 out of the 3 tellers testified in behalf of the hostage takers. And they found this to be true in skyjacking, and they found it to be true for men and women both, that they sort of fell into these categories where they started identifying with the aggressor. So they're looking at the precursors, and I use that sometimes when I'm doing assessments. The precursors to the hostage syndrome are, the first one is that you have to perceive a threat to your physical or emotional well-being. So you have to believe that there's a threat. And the second thing is you have to believe that the person who makes that threat or is implying that threat can carry it out. The third thing is the perception of kindness on the part of the perpetrator. Now, if you're dealing with a stranger hostage situation, it can be simply the absence of violence. For instance, people generally at the beginning of a hostage, well, I can't say generally, but at the beginning of the hostage situation, maybe, have guns held on them, they might be threatened, they might be kept apart, they may be physically mishandled, all kinds of things. And then over time, the relationship sort of stabilizes, and what you see is people are allowed to go to the restroom, or they're allowed to talk to each other, things like that. So hostages in stranger situations can see the absence of violence as kindness, the perception of kindness. So what happens is, because of the isolation and the fear, their perceptions get skewed. Now, the fourth precursor is the monopolization of perception, which I went over this morning, but it's really looking at the fact that when you're in a situation and you're terrified and you're afraid that somebody's really going to hurt you and you're isolated, but you hope you can get out of it, that your focus is on the people that have the power. And so the monopolization of perception. And the fifth thing is the perceived inability to escape. Now, in a stranger hostage situation, that can be true because most people, even in that situation, don't plan their escape. They perceive that they cannot escape, even in stranger situations. But in an intimate situation, there's that perception that you can't get out. That if you leave, if there are children involved, for instance, you might not be able to get out because you're going to have custody and exchanges and that sort of thing. But the perception is that you can't leave. And those are the precursors. And by the way, the perception of kindness is absolutely not just a perception in an abusive relationship, because people who are abusive are also kind. And they can be very kind to the person and very caring for the person, which is part of the conundrum, and it's part of what keeps people in that relationship, is that it's not just a perception of kindness, there really is kindness.
Okay. Well, and so how you talked about these precursors, and how does it apply to a domestic violence relationship? And I know we just discussed about the perception of kindness, but how do the other ones, the perceived threat of physical violence, the belief that the person can actually perpetrate the violence?
Well, it's not just a perception of physical violence, it's also a perception of emotional violence.
Okay.
So there's a perception that your emotional well-being's at stake. And so somebody can do that by repeatedly telling people that they're going to leave them or putting them down or whatever that is. So it doesn't have to be just physical. But if it's physical, then you have more than a perception, you have the accuracy of that perception. And if the person has done it to you, then that person is capable of doing it. So the person who makes the threat is capable of making the threat. And between episodes, there's kindness. There's sort of, you can go on vacation together, you can have good times with each other, you can you can enjoy things in common. You can have evenings where you're just sitting and watching TV together, or enjoying your other family members, or having parties, or whatever. So there is real kindness and bonding kinds of things that are going on in that relationship.
And what does that do to a victim's ability to leave when you have these periods of kindness and real bonding?
Well, it makes it really difficult to leave, because that's what you hope. You hope that it will stay like that. You hope that the relationship is going to remain connected in that way. And your belief is, gee, I think it can be. I think we can keep it like this. I mean, I have this evidence that we've just had this period of time, and we're doing well, and it looks good, and so you're hopeful again, and you're seeing that person as they were when you fell in love with them, or when you developed that love for them. You're seeing them in that way at that time, until the relationship has gone on long enough where you stop believing that it's going to get better.
You stop the hope?
You stop the hope. And that depends on the person, how long that takes.
Okay, you know my next question of how long, okay. What is chronic apprehension?
Chronic apprehension was actually a term coined in the substance abuse movement, but it's once again something I think applies to domestic violence. And it was coined by Jael Greenleaf. And what she said was that people who are substance abusers get a break. They party, they drink or use, they act out, they get support from the people they're acting out with. For a period of time, they get support from their families. But the people who live with substance abusers never get a break, because they live in chronic apprehension of the next episode. And I think that applies very well. It's a good analogy for domestic violence, because after a period of time, you stop feeling like you have a break. You're emotionally tired. And that's what happens to people in relationships where there's repeated episodes, is that you get emotionally tired. And as your resistance goes down, you begin to believe or wonder when the shoe is going to fall.
So even though you might be experiencing this time of calm in the relationship with a person who's under chronic apprehension, are they always tense? Are they always waiting for the next episode, so they're not able to have that relaxation?
By the time they're chronically apprehensive, they are tense a lot of the time. But there's a buildup with any of these things. So there's a buildup of that. You don't have chronic apprehension until you get it, whenever that is. But you begin to develop that apprehension because you begin to believe that this is going to happen again.
Okay. And I guess, is that the important part to know when we talk about the steps of how a relationship like this can be formed? Where you're asking people, when he first calls you a name, would you leave? And things like that. Is that the importance of how a relationship is formed, that it doesn't start immediately? In other words, on the first date you go out, if he doesn't if he hits you, what are the chances the person is going to leave on the first date?
Pretty good.
Okay. So is that something that you look at then with your patients, basically, with the length of time? Well, I guess not always the length of time, but the buildup of that relationship.
You do look at the buildup of the relationship, because the relationship generally is more gradual, and there's a period of time where things look good, and there's a period of time where the perpetrator of domestic violence is not as afraid, because that energy from new love is bigger than the energy of that fear. And so it takes a while for the relationship to stabilize and the energy of new love to sort of come down and the fear to come up.
Okay. Can we talk about the cycle of violence?
Sure.
I mean, that seems to be a term that is out there. Is there a definition for it, or what is it?
The cycle of violence is a term that was coined by Lenore Walker. She is probably the godmother of the domestic violence movement. She wrote one of the first books, and it was the first book to really reach national acclaim, and it was called The Battered Woman. And she wrote it in 1979. And she describes a cycle of violence. And the cycle of violence is basically a tension-building phase, an episode, and a honeymoon phase. So that what happens is there's tension, it builds, there's an incident, whether that incident is emotional, whether that incident is physical, whether that incident is verbal. That happens, and then there's the honeymoon. And the honeymoon phase is where they make up. There's that rekindled hope again. There's that belief that things will change. There's, we used to say people bring flowers or gifts during that period of time. Now, the difference is that some people never get a honeymoon, depending, or that the honeymoon phase sort of diminishes over time, and that what happens is you get the tension building in the episode, but you don't get the honeymoon. You don't get the remorse, you don't get the gifts, you don't get the apologies over time.
Okay. And when you talk about these phases, is there a timeline that can you guess at all, or give us an idea? I mean, when you talk about tension building, are you talking about 2 minutes of tension because we're arguing, then the episode, and then honeymoon for the next 5 minutes? Is it something like that, or longer?
There's no magic number with that either. I mean, depending on the relationship and maybe how many prior relationships have been abusive and that sort of thing, depending on the relationship, you could have a long tension building phase. You could have, and I think most of us who've been in long-term relationships know about tension building, because we can have periods in that relationship where things are tough and there's a tension that builds. And so you can look at that, the cycle of violence, and you can sort of say, well, gee, that happens in my relationship because we've had this tension, and then we get angry, we have an argument, and then we make up. It's just that the cycle of violence includes abusive behavior, and it's different. And so relationships can be cyclical, but what we're really looking at is that this goes on over time. There is a diminishing of being, sorry. There is an escalation generally in what the incidents look like. And so there's not a time that you can actually say, because it depends on the relationship. Now, there are relationships that are really, really horrific, and that can be, you can have a tension building phase, and you can have incidents every week. Some people have incidents several times a week, but most people get a little better break than that.
So you're saying that even in healthy relationships, you can see this cycle?
Well, what you can see is not the cycle of violence.
Okay.
You see a cyclical nature, which is, we have tension, and maybe we don't have the money to pay the bills this month. So there's tension. And I don't like the way you spend it, and you don't like the way I spend it. So we build up, and we have an argument with each other about that, and then we make up, and we figure out how to solve the problem. That's the difference.
Okay. Well, and the tension, and when you say the episode, in a healthy relationship, the episode is just an argument?
The episode's an argument, and the episode's just conflict that hopefully gets resolved, you know.
But in a violent or domestic violence type relationship, that episode would be different then, I guess.
The episode would be different because it would be abusive in some way.
Okay.
And then what you would have is the person making up maybe, or, for a period of time anyway. And, but there wouldn't really be a resolution that happened, because it would repeat itself. So what we tend to say, or what we used to say, was the cycle of violence escalates over time in intensity and frequency. And that doesn't happen in a healthy relationship where you learn how to manage conflict.
Okay. Because I guess in a healthy relationship, is that conflict resolved?
It can be resolved, or it can go on, but you don't do the same thing with the information because you're not coming from the same place.
Okay. Okay. Is there a difference in your practice in counseling men and women? Is there a difference between men and women's anger? I'm
Well-
sorry, actually, what I want to talk about first is fear. Let's talk fear first. Is there a difference between the way men and women fear?
There tends to be a difference in the way men and women fear. There's a piece of research that was done in, I think, the late 80s by Pat Rosé and Kim Mizrahi, where they looked at the numbers of behaviors that women do in terms of safety precautions every day. For instance, not walking out maybe alone at night, having your keys out, maybe looking in your car first, maybe restricting your behavior based on where you're going. For some people, they won't get in an elevator alone because you're told basically not to. That's a self-defense kind of thing that they talk to people about. And men usually don't do that in the same way. But most women, by the time they're in their 30s, have had some kind of exchange with a man where they feel one down. And so they know they're physically vulnerable in that way. The other thing is that women tend to develop or get vicarious trauma over time. And it's something you live with, it's something you walk around and you don't think about during the day. I don't think about taking my keys out but I do. I don't think about looking, I do go out with people at night. I don't go out by myself, in particular walking at night without someone else around. And so we tend to take more precautions, and people do that, parents do that with their children. Usually parents who have boys and girls tend to be a little more cautious of what happens and give their girls and boys different advice in terms of going out at night with, and that sort of thing. So the other thing that happens with women a lot is that there are a lot of television shows on and a lot of movies where women are being stalked, or 48 Hours Mystery, Dateline, Lifetime Channel, a lot of places where you'll see domestic violence, or you'll see somebody who looks like they've been great all their lives, and then all of a sudden there's a divorce or a breakup, and this person goes crazy and hurts their partner. So I believe that we take that information in too, and that we're not immune from it. And then once we take it in, if somebody does something that is frightening, we get more frightened by it. It's not that there aren't abused men, because there are, but it's more difficult to physically abuse a man because men tend to feel like they still have control. If I was coming at you and hitting you, you might feel like you could grab my arms and stop me in a way that I might not feel like I could do with you, unless I had an equalizer, So if I had some sort of a weapon, that would be maybe the way that you would be afraid. But you wouldn't be afraid of me probably in other ways, unless I made a viable threat to you or something like that. So it's not that men can't be battered, it's that it takes a little bit more because women tend to be afraid more quickly. The research, the latest research, looks at what happens in a heterosexual relationship when a man hits a woman and a woman hits a man. And the response tends to be, if a woman hits a man, that the man tends to laugh it off or be angry at her. And if a woman is hit by a man, that she tends to be humiliated and afraid. So the psychological response tends to be different as well.
Well, you mentioned vicarious trauma. Do you mean that's because of what women see on these channels?
Yeah, it's because of what people see, it's what people read. It's if they're reading, murder mysteries, they're reading, they're seeing things on television, and a lot of things, and a lot of the movies that are out too involve stalking women, involve, rape, they involve a lot of crimes against women. And so women do have a certain amount of vicarious trauma when they see that. And if somebody scares them, then they tend to get scared more rapidly, and you can also be scared for a period of time. I've had numbers of clients who have had things happen like somebody try to get in their house after them, and when they walk back, into that situation, even months later, they're still afraid. If they came in on a certain specific evening and it was, they were walking into the house at that evening and it was dark out, that when they walked in, they would show behaviors where they looked around, where they made sure their keys were out, that sort of thing.
Okay. What about anger? Is there a difference between how men and women are viewed when they're angry?
Yeah, and this is something else I do in my workshops. I will ask, when we're talking about gender and anger and that sort of thing, when are women praised for their anger? And I ask men and women that. And generally, what I get is never or in defense of your children. And that's true. And I ask them, what do people call angry women? And I think you can probably guess, and I don't need to say it, because there is a perception that angry women are tend to be judged more harshly than angry men. In the same way that men are judged more harshly for other emotions, maybe they show that they're feeling bad, or they look like they're sad, or they're depressed. They may be judged harshly on those issues too, but women tend to be judged harshly in regard to anger and assertiveness.
So how does that fit into a domestic violence relationship?
Well, in a certain way, you're crossing a cultural norm to be angry, but it's more how you're judged or perceived when you are maybe out of that relationship, or if you are in the relationship and you wind up saying something that isn't very nice to your partner or whatever, and nobody knows why you're saying it, but you sound angry, you look angry. It's not an emotion it's not like women don't get angry. It's just that they tend to be less direct with it, more sort of this way.
Okay. Are you aware of any studies that have been done with regard to the difference in men and women's brains?
Well, actually, there's a study that just came out with Daniel Amen. I watched Dr. Oz, so he was on Dr. Oz, and he did the largest gender-based study on the brain, and it was 46,000 brain scans.
Let me interrupt you for a second. I know you said that you saw it on Dr. Oz, but is this somebody, Dr. Amen, is this someone that you know or have researched other than seeing him on TV?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay.
Dr. Amen is somebody who's, he's controversial. What he does is he does brain scans on people who have been violent and people who have been using drugs and that sort of thing, and he compares them with a normal brain. And he shows areas of the brain that light up or areas of the brain that are deficient and that sort of thing. And he does that comparison. So he compared men and women's brains, and he found that
Or expertise.
Thanks a bunch.
continue.
Ms. Violet, in your experience, have you seen with the women that you have treated, have you noticed them to be empathetic?
Yes, I've noticed them to be empathetic. In fact, one of the things we used to say at the shelter was they over-empathized.
Okay. And is that something in particular that you've noticed with women?
Yes, I've noticed that with women, although I'm sure that had I worked with some men who were battered, I would notice empathy with them too, but you tend to notice it with women, and you tend to notice that when they get really upset, and there's been an incident, that once they have time to have a little recovery period, they tend to feel for their partners for at least a period of time and sympathize with them. As I said, when I started at the shelter, the women in the shelter would say to me, you know, our partners have been abused as children, and we understand that. And so when, you know, when we feel bad for them, and we know that they're acting this way because of how they were treated when they were children. So
women having empathy, how does that play into a domestic violence relationship?
well, it is one of the factors that can keep somebody in a relationship for a longer period of time, because you keep understanding why that person is doing what they're doing, and you sort of dismiss how you feel to look at how they feel. And so it can keep you stuck,
Keep you from leaving?
keep you from leaving.
And are you aware of any studies other than just because you saw something on Dr. Oz, have you actually read through studies that talk about women's empathy?
No, I have not.
Okay. Are you aware of a study with regard to empathy in brain scans?
I am, but it's a study that Dr. Aman did.
Yes, oh, right, okay. And with regard to Dr. Aman, you didn't partake in that study, right?
No, I did not.
Okay, and brain scans aren't your specialty?
No, they're not.
Okay. However, are you able to understand what Dr. Aman did?
I'm able to understand what he reported.
Okay.
That I think everybody would understand what he reported.
All right. And did he report with regard to women and empathy?
He did. He reported that women's brains.
Objection, again, on Foundation Daubert.
Approach, please.
We were talking about women and how you've noticed women have empathy. which can cause problems for them in their relationships if they're in an abusive relationship. What about the men that you treat in the groups that you have, your men groups? Do you have a goal for them?
I have, besides their goals for themselves, one of the goals I have is to try to change belief systems, because if you don't change the belief, the behavior change doesn't stick as long, and it just takes longer to change beliefs, like beliefs about using aggressions or belief about themselves, those beliefs about what the world is like for them, So I work hard to change the belief about themselves and the belief about using aggression to solve problems.
And do you work with empathy with the men that you work with?
Yes, we do a lot of empathy work with the men, and I gave an example this morning of one of the exercises that we do, but I think about, for a lot of the men, that once they can identify with their own victimization and how they were, mistreated as children, most of them, that it is easier then to make the leap to understand what it's like for someone else. And it's harder, the way I see empathy move generally in group is that first people feel bad for what happened to them. They feel bad about their lives and how their lives are looking. And then they identify with the other men in the program, and they start to feel bad for them. And the place that is easier to get people, even very violent people, to identify is if they have children. It's easier to move through because they tend to empathize with their children. And the last place that they tend to empathize is with their adult partner. And so we're moving in the direction of being able to empathize with the adult partner. But sometimes we have to use other things. And one of the things, and I think about one of the young men in gangs that we worked with, and he had a daughter, and we asked him what he would like a relationship for his daughter to look like, to get him to start thinking about what he would tolerate with his own daughter and how he treated his own wife.
So is that the way, is that how you try and build empathy with the men in your group? By talking about situations close to them, but not them specifically?
No, I talk about situations with them specifically and situations that aren't about them specifically. Sometimes it's easier to empathize with someone else, but it's easier for them to empathize with themselves when they were children, which is why, I sometimes ask them to think about when they were children, to the empathy that they might have for themselves as children. I remember one of the men was talking about his little brother and him, and they were aggravating the heck out of their dad. Their mother was at the market, and their father took a knife and chased them. And they were running away, and he was trying to protect his little brother, and he was pushing his little brother under a bed, and his dad was doing this with a knife, and the mother came home, and the knife is placed back in his waistband, and nobody says anything about what happened. And the mother doesn't know what happened, but the little boys don't talk about it. And this was a man in his 40s, and as he's telling this story, he feels so emotionally about it, he starts to cry and talk about how afraid he was. And it's that ability to see not only that you can feel things so much longer from when they actually happen, that 30 years can pass, and that you can still have feelings about something that happened to you, that you can still be traumatized by what happened to you, and that so he notices the long-term effects. So when he wants his partner to forgive him, he's got more understanding that it might take his partner longer than he wants it to take, but that he also sees what it's like for him. And then you can say to somebody, well, how do you think it feels for the people in your life when you treat them badly? What do you think it feels like for them? But you give people a chance to really get into their own feelings. You don't ram anything down their throats.
Well, along those lines, let me give you a hypothetical, okay?
All right.
So let's say you have a man who's in your group, and he's talking to you about his childhood, okay? In his childhood, as a boy, he had extreme neglect from his parents. At times, this boy was homeless, didn't have a place to live. At times that because he was homeless, he was unable to clean himself or have good clothes, and he would get made fun of at school. At times, he knows that his parents were drug addicts, so he had to deal with that. At times, he would know that he would see or hear about violence between his dad to his mom and his mom to his dad. Somebody growing up in a family situation like this, even if he doesn't see everything, but he's part of this family, what do you expect for that man now that he's a man in your group? How is that person, what type of things do you see then as a man treating him?
Well, you can see a lot of things because there are variables that can help him along the way. But if you're making an assumption that there's no intervention and...
Let's assume there's no intervention. Let's assume that he does not have an adult to count on at a young age.
It's very difficult for a child who grows up like that not to have a number of issues in relationship, because children who grow up in abusive families tend to have a lot of feelings of powerlessness. They tend to have some...
Not answering the question, lack of foundation. This was not an abusive family mentioned.
May we approach?
You may approach.
A child who grows up in an environment like that, who is neglected, who can't bathe all the time, who has parents who are violent to each other, who have parents who are drug addicts, would you consider that abusive?
Yes,
is that
I
an
would.
abusive family environment?
It's an abusive family environment.
Okay, so I know you just mentioned abusive, so even though if that child necessarily wasn't hit, do you consider this type of environment for a child to grow up in, is that abusive?
It's very abusive.
Okay, so now back to what you would see with a man who were you coming. What do you expect this child to do when he grows up? How does this child deal with what he lived with as a child?
Well, there's something that happens based on the personality of the child and how they take it in. It's whether they blame themselves for what happened. It's whether they feel like there's any way out for them. But what they've learned is a lot of negative coping skills. What they've learned, if you think about what someone learns, and I think about that, I love my parents and I think they were terrific parents. But even when you have terrific parents, sometimes you say, if I have kids, I'm not going to do exactly what my parents did, or there's this thing I'm not going to do that my parents did. And when your back's against the wall and you get upset with your kids, sometimes you wind up channeling the very thing you said you weren't going to say. Some of those things like, because I said so, because, the things that we say sometimes as parents. And when someone has learned to be fearful, because I don't think you can live in a drug-addicted family with people who are violent and not be fearful. You learn to be fearful. You go into your adult life, and where that plays out, it may not play out in your professional life in the same way. In your professional life, you might be okay because you're not challenged emotionally at the same kind of level that you are as in an intimate relationship.
So what do you mean professionally speaking? That person can have
You
a
can
good
be
profession?
successful in your job, you can have a good job, but where you tend to be tested the way you were, or not exactly the way you were, but emotionally, is in your intimate relationship. So what I hear from the men that I work with is they get in a situation with their partner and they're thrown back to that powerlessness that they had when they're kids, and they don't know what to do with it. And so they act to stop that powerlessness. And a way to stop powerlessness is to get bigger and more powerful, either verbally, emotionally, physically, than that other person who they see as making them feel powerless. And the other thing I think that's really important to look at with children is that kids don't have cognitive ability to explain what's happening to them. They don't have the language to say what's happening, and they don't have the life experience. So they're left, kids are pretty feeling beings. They're left with the feelings. And the feelings are what come up when they're in an adult relationship and they feel powerless.
Does having this type of traumatic childhood, does it affect somebody when they're young, like say up to 6 or 7 years old, versus if they were a teenager when it started to happen?
There are things that happen to older kids that can be tolerated a lot better than when they're little, because older kids have the ability to have friendships. Maybe they've had a solid childhood until they're older. And so they've had this period where they've had consistency, they've had a good life, they've had people they can count on, and then they have something traumatic happen and they're teenagers, but they have more of an ability to handle it, where little kids, may not. For instance, family that came into the shelter with 5 children under the age of 6, the infant was suffering failure to thrive based on what was going on in the family. All of these children were little. All of these children had full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder and would hide under beds when any adult came in the room. It didn't matter if you were male or female. They were afraid of adults, and they were very hypervigilant, and it took them a little while to be able to be comfortable with even walking, being able to walk in the room with them. So things that are tolerated by teenagers may be very hard to tolerate for a small child.
And so a child who grows up like this, who has this type of childhood when they're young, and they grow up, do they learn how to deal with their relationships without intervention? Do they have a specific way of how they deal with relationships because of what they learned when they were a child?
Well, I wouldn't say that it was specific necessarily, but I would say that they would not have the skills to deal with an intimate relationship because they didn't learn the skills to deal with an intimate relationship. I mean, most of us probably haven't seen our parents fight a lot. Some parents will go behind closed doors and they'll have their arguments and whatever. But if your parents acted out a lot in front of you, you're shaken up in a different way than when you don't see that. If you see loving affection between your parents and it's consistent, you see that that's how you treat somebody in a loving relationship. I always remember my dad coming home from work and...
Sustained.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Are you familiar with the term chronic combat readiness?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Chronic combat readiness is a term that was used in an article by Bruce Perry, who does a lot of work with children who have committed violent crimes or children who've grown up in abuse. And what he says is that if you live in an abusive household, that what you grow up with is the kind of situation you're living basically in a war zone. And if you live in a war zone, you have to be hypervigilant. You have to see the threat in things, because a lot of these kids grow up and they see things as threatening that the rest of us wouldn't. They see a look or a tone or whatever that we might be unaffected by that affects them in a way. So chronic combat readiness is like the notion of living your life in a combat zone. If you grow up in a violent family, and if you grow up from childhood in a violent family, and you have a number of years in that violent family, then you're flooded with stress hormones. You're in fight versus flight a lot of the time, which means you're not operating from your cortex as much. You're operating from your reptilian brain. You're operating from a place where the blood's rushing to your extremities, and you're ready to fight. And kids do a lot of things in that situation. I mean, I would suspect a lot of the people I've worked with who bullied people came from violent families.
Okay. And the men that you've worked with in all the years that you've done this, do you have an idea of percentage of these men that you've worked with who have come from traumatic childhoods or abusive childhood families?
My experience has been that almost everybody I've worked with has come from some sort of violent situation. And that could have been in foster care, that could have been with their parents, that could have been with their primary caregivers, and it could also be exacerbated by living in a violent neighborhood. But the research was showing something like 60 to 70%, but that's because most of the research was done before people really understood that they lived in violence. In other words, they would say, well, you know, that happened to me because I needed to be disciplined. So, you know, of course I had to be beaten because I did something to deserve it. And so they didn't define it as violence. And it wasn't until after they understood violence a little better. So I would say it's much closer to, you know, we're not supposed to say 100% to anything, so I won't say 100%, but it's closer to that. And it depends, once again, on the degree to which somebody acts out in their own intimate relationship. The worst kinds of violence tend to be perpetrated by the people who've lived in the worst kinds of environments and grown up in the worst kinds of environments.
Okay. Oh, Judge.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will take the afternoon recess. Please be back in the designated area at 3:15. Please remember the admonition, you are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
You may step down. We are at recess. Thank you. Please be seated. Ms. LaViolette, please take the stand. Council, why don't you approach for a moment?
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You may continue.
Ms. LaViolette, I know that we talked about victims of abuse and how in your practice you've seen them not file police reports or not tell the doctors what actually happened. Have you ever seen situations of what happens when these victims of abuse come to trial to testify?
It's,
Approach.
Ms. LaViolette, in your practice, have you spoken with many women victims of abuse?
Yes, I have.
And you said that you've counseled these women as well, is that right?
Yes, I have.
And in speaking with them, have they talked to you about whether or not they're able or have been willing to make police reports or report their abuser to the police?
Yes, they have.
And,
I'm
and
sorry.
have they talked to you about whether or not they have been willing to seek medical treatment when their abuser has harmed them in some way?
Yes, they've talked to me about that.
And have they talked to you about when they've been called to testify
Yes.
about
Yes,
Is that a yes? Okay.
I'm sorry.
And when they talk to you about these things, what do they say about police reports?
Many of the women don't make police reports. Some of the ones that do change their minds when the police actually come out, and they might change the story if they've called 911. They may come back. Some of the women actually follow through. It sort of depends on where they are in that whole progression.
Of the relationship?
Of the relationship. But some of the women absolutely follow through with the police report.
And then have they talked to you about, if they followed through with the police report, have they talked to you about what happens if they're called to testify against their abuser?
Yes, many of them recant. I think we have about, this is what I've been told by the court, that there are about 80%.
Sustained.
Have you worked with the courts before?
Yes, I have.
And when you work with the courts, what have you done?
Well, we had a domestic violence court in Long Beach,
Yes?
so the judge would meet with us on and off. I have consulted on some cases. I'm not sure, are you talking about with the?
Well, in order to have knowledge about, you were going to give us, I think, a number or some sort of what happens when
right.
women recant. How do you have that knowledge?
I have that knowledge because I've talked not only to people who run battered women's shelters, but also because I know some of the judges, or I knew some of the judges. We had a domestic violence court, and the judge is in Sedona now. She moved, and so we don't have that court anymore. But when we had it for 8 years. And they gave us information about what they saw, as did the shelters talk about what they had seen, and the victim advocates, because they're victim advocates in the court.
And then that information plus you speaking with these women yourself, right?
Yes.
And so what happens when these women get to court? You said they recant. What does that mean?
It means that oftentimes, and I would just like to say that frequently, there's a long period of time between when a case is filed and when it gets to court. And so it might be a month, it could be 2 months before it actually gets into the court process. And during that time, if the couple stays together, many of them have reconciled. So you could,
So what happens when a couple reconciles then, with regard to the woman wanting to testify?
she doesn't want to testify because she doesn't want her partner to lose his job, or she doesn't want that on the record. And in California, there are a lot of fees associated with proceeding. There's a Penal Code 273.5, which is called corporal injury to a spouse. And if you plead nolo contendere, that you're not contesting it, or you are found guilty of 273.5, you have to do 52 weeks in a batterer's intervention program, a minimum of 52 weeks. You have to pay a fine to a battered women's program. You have to pay court fines for going through the court process. You have to do community service, and depending on what you do, depends on how much community service you have to do. And you also, you're on probation for 3 years. Can be reduced. You can file to have it reduced to 2 years, but you're on probation for a period of time. During that 1 year period, you also have to come back to court every quarter with a court report from your program to show, what you're doing and how you're progressing in that program.
And so how does that affect women, whether they recant or not?
It affects the family financially. It also affects the women depending on how angry the men are that they have to go through this process. And in my group, some of the men are very angry and blaming their partners for being stuck in court, being stuck in a program for a while, that sort of thing. But beyond that, for many of the men, there's a relief in being in the program, actually. But they still have to pay fines. They still have to pay fees for the group every week. And in California, we do a sliding scale, which means we have to serve people on a range of incomes. So there's usually an opportunity for somebody to get help and to be able to afford it. But it is financially sometimes a burden on the family to go through that.
And so how often, based on all the knowledge you have with regard to the women you've seen and speaking with the judges and working with the domestic violence program, how often do these women recant?
There's, the estimate's about 80% of the time.
Okay. So even if they're able to get to the point where they're able to make a report and not change their mind when the police come, once they get to court, 80% of the time, these women are actually taking it back?
That's the estimate that I've been given. The other thing I would say is that for some of the women, that the court process has been very difficult for them, and they don't feel that they've gotten supported when they've, for them, stuck their necks out. And so the ability for them to then go forward and push or to report a second time is diminished because depending on what happens the first time.
Does that go back to the feeling that an abuse victim might have that no one's going to believe her if she reports it?
It goes back to not only feeling believed, but feeling blamed. Because adult female victims are oftentimes blamed. You know, child victims are seen as helpless child victims. But adults are oftentimes, their victimization is not recognized in the same way. And they are seen as more culpable. So there's a lot of judgment. And it depends on how you feel you're treated in the court, how you feel you're treated by the original police officers that come out. And in many cities, there's a domestic violence unit, and people are specially trained, and they go out and they have what are called DART teams, domestic abuse response teams. And they actually go out and really take an interview and do that kind of thing and give resources to people. But if there are children involved, they also will send out a child abuse worker to respond with the kids. So if there are children involved, they have to send somebody out. So they're trying to address this in a more holistic way, so there's more support for families or individuals where there's domestic violence.
Okay. When you have someone coming to your men's group, joining your men's group, do you do some sort of an intake or an interview with them?
Yes, I do.
And what do you do? Who do you interview?
In my groups, I do something that's unusual, and it's because of the work I did in the shelter. Because I worked in the shelter, I knew more of the whole story initially because I would have the women and children in the shelter, and I knew what happened to them. And sometimes we'd have medical records or police records, but we'd also have the women and children that were interviewed. So when I'd do my initial assessment with the men who were in relationship to those women, oftentimes the stories were very, very different. And so I thought it's very important for me to be able to do my work well and to really have a picture of what's going on and sort of assess a level of dangerousness. It's important for me to be able to interview the victim. So what I do is if there is no protective order and the couple is still together, I invite the victim to come into the intake, but I see them separately. So I get, and if the victim does not want to come in, if the survivor does not want to come in, then I try to do an interview over the phone because I want to get a bigger picture about what's going on, and I generally will not get it from the person who's coming into my program because there's a lot of shame attached to telling me, about what happens. Actually, Lenore Walker used to say, the old saying, if there are two stories, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Lenore would say if there are two stories and there's domestic violence, the truth is worse than either of them because everybody's minimizing and denying. So even in that kind of a situation, I find that people play down what's going on.
So do you find that with the men who are coming in to ask you for help, that they play down what they've done or what's going on?
Yeah, for instance, I might have somebody, I'll ask a question about substance abuse, or drugs or alcohol, a problem in your family. And that's not where I start, but that's a question that I will ask. And, one of the men said, no, we're social drinkers and we have, a couple martinis at night. And so I asked his partner, his wife, the same thing. And I said, if are drugs or alcohol, a problem in your family? And she said, absolutely. And I said, well, what's a problem, drugs or alcohol? She said, alcohol. And I said, why is that a problem, or why is that a problem for you? And she said, well, because he says we have 1 or 2 drinks a night, but his drinks are like in a vat. So when we have 1 or 2 drinks, it's like he has 3 drinks for every one. So it's like he's having 6 martinis instead of 3.
So does that give you a bigger picture when you're interviewing both?
It absolutely gives me a bigger picture.
And when you're interviewing the woman or the victim of abuse, do you find that person tends to minimize what's actually happening in the home?
Most of the time, the women are protective of the men that they're with, and they are very cautious about telling me. For instance, I'm a mandated reporter, so if they report child abuse, I have to report it. So I tell them the limits of my confidentiality, that these are the things that I'm going to have to report. I have to report child abuse if that's occurring, and I have to report a danger to self or others. So if there's an imminent threat, so if somebody comes into the office and says, I'm going to seriously injure or hurt somebody, I have to do something about that. So I tell them the limits of my confidentiality, and then we talk.
Uh-huh.
And it's it's very conversational. I don't have a lot of papers and fill things out. I try to just have a conversation with people. But I ask them questions. I ask them both the same kinds of questions to sort of see if there's a great difference in the stories. Because if there's a big difference in the stories, I've got a bigger problem. And if the stories match up a little bit, it's usually because both people are feeling like they can tell the truth a little more, and there's not as much shame attached or something, like they're able to do that.
Okay. Do you ever counsel couples together if they're in a domestic violence relationship?
I will not. I can't think of domestic violence couples I've counseled together for a few reasons. One is that, first of all, when I do an intake, even in couples counseling, I separate people so I can hear 2 different versions, whatever they're going to tell me about what's going on in their lives, because I never know if somebody's referring to me for domestic violence or for couples counseling. I don't know. And so I separate couples so I get more of a picture of what's going on. And then when I bring people back together, we can talk about what might be a good strategy, what might be a good way to work, what might be a good referral if they need a referral, that sort of thing. But if it turns out that they're coming in and he's going to participate in my group, I'm definitely not going to, first of all, it would be a conflict to counsel them together. But if there's domestic violence, safety is an issue that we look at very seriously. So the safety of the survivor is really important. If we bring them together in a couples counseling situation, we actually don't know what happens when they go home if it's contentious in that situation. We don't know what we could be, sort of generating in that situation. So safety reasons. The second thing is that when there's a situation where one person feels like the bad guy, they usually feel like their partner is a better person than they are. And if they don't know how to make that level, the only thing they know how to do is level the playing field. So if you're leveling the playing field, what happens is if you leave and you're in couples counseling is you remember what the therapist has said about your partner and not what they've said about you. So, doing couples counseling, for me, means that there has to be some kind of balance in the relationship so you don't have a good guy, bad guy situation going on. And the
Are you-
third,
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
go,
with the
no,
third
go
thing.
ahead.
No, go ahead. I was gonna, if there's a third thing, I was gonna talk about something else.
Okay, and the third reason I don't do couples counseling is because if I want somebody to change in a domestically violent situation, I want a perpetrator to change, I can't continue to confront that person in front of the person that he or she has hurt, because they'll never feel good enough about themselves to take responsibility for what they've done or to even look at it. So it's like continually shaming somebody in front of somebody that they've hurt. So they're better off doing separate things.
Okay. All right. And you said you talked about the leveling the playing field. When you're interviewing these people, do you look for that balance of power that you've talked about?
I absolutely look for a balance of power. And I ask questions. I ask some questions that I almost ask all the time. And sometimes they go a different way because the people I'm working with are different. But for instance, I usually ask people why they're there. What brings you here? What is the situation that brings you there? Sometimes there's a very different story even in that situation, but I want to get both people's perspective about what's brought them there. And I ask them if they like each other. Yeah, they're separate at this time. So I ask them, do you like your partner? Oh, I love my partner. And I said, I didn't ask if you loved your partner. Do you like your partner? Is your partner your friend? Because I want to see sort of what the condition of the relationship is. Do you like this person? Do you respect them? I usually ask them if what they do, how they handle conflict. When they get upset with each other, how do you handle it? If they, I ask them if they've ever laid hands on each other. Because if you ask if there's pushing or slapping or grabbing, you'd have to ask each thing. If they tell me they've laid hands on each other, I can ask them what happened and how that happened. I ask them if they ever call each other names when they argue. And one of the things I want to see is what they think is normal, what they think is okay, what they feel they're entitled to do when they have an argument with each other. I generally ask them if they've ever threatened their partners. Do you ever threaten to leave? Do you ever threaten to, in any kind of a way, have you ever threatened to do physical harm? I find out that kind of information. I ask them about family of origin kinds of things. And this is really important because what I find is that I get so much more information from the survivor than I do from the perpetrator, even on these issues. And so when I ask, for instance, I had a young man and a young woman in, and I asked him about his family, and he told me that he came from, a family that wasn't very close, but he made it sound like it was a fairly normal family, but his mother had died when he was young, and didn't describe a lot with that family. When I interviewed his wife, she said, "Did he tell you what happened to him when he was 6?" And I said, "Well, I can't tell you what he said, but you can tell me whatever you want to tell me." And she said, "Well, when he was 6 years old, he was sitting on the couch with his mom, with his dad and his brother, and they were watching a movie. And his mother came in, and she just looked at the family, and then she left and went into the bedroom, and 2 shots rang out in the bedroom. And nobody ever got off the couch to see what happened until the commercial. And when they went in, his mother had shot herself." Now that tells me a lot about this man's life that I would not have known had I not brought both people in. So I get a much better picture all the way around. I can also find out about targets of abuse. It sort of, do you, ever get in fights outside of your family kind of thing, information about that. Sometimes I find out if somebody has a criminal record. There are just lots of different ways to get information with this.
And ultimately, does that help you then once you start figuring out if a man's coming into your men's group, does that ultimately help you to figure out where you need to go with him?
It does. It helps me to figure out, it's not one size fits all. It's sort of like you have to tailor what you're doing to the person that's in the room with you. And so without breaching anybody's confidentiality, you can do that. For instance, I had a young man who was very jealous and used to interrogate his girlfriend and do lots of, different things like that. Well, I don't say to him, well, your girlfriend told me you're jealous, but what I can talk to him is, I can talk about, for instance, in group that night, we might talk about non-physical ways of controlling somebody. And we can talk about the ways those things happen and make that more specific to that person or, but generalize it to the group.
Okay. We talked a little bit about the cycle of violence. Is that something, which is something that Lenore Walker created, is that right?
Yes, Lenore Walker developed that concept.
And I think you said that was in 1979?
Yes.
Is the cycle of violence, is that idea, is that still used today, or is there any controversy about it?
It's not used as much today, although a lot of victims of domestic violence really resonate with it. It's not used as much because there's controversy about the honeymoon phase, because over time, a lot of survivors don't get a honeymoon. And so the honeymoon can simply be, and I'm using honeymoon in quote, it can simply be the absence of aggression, and it feels like a honeymoon because nothing really bad's happening. So the terminology is controversial.
Okay, and since Ms. Walker has written her book in 1979, has there been a lot of research since that time adding on to the ideas and the knowledge we now have about domestic violence?
There's a lot of research, and there's people that specialize in working with victims of domestic violence and have written on victims and responses of victims. And there's a book, two books right now that are very good with looking at non-physical violence. One's called The Verbally Abusive Relationship by Patricia Evans, and one's called The Emotionally Abusive Relationship, and that's by Beverly Engel. So there's one that Evan Stark just did I think about 4 years ago, called Coercive Controlling Behaviors. That's really about coercion in relationship without having to use physical violence, but using purely psychological abuse and verbal abuse. And
what you're describing, the later research that's been done, it makes it sound as though Ms. Walker's research was based on physical violence only. Is that what you mean?
actually, she had physical, verbal, and sexual, I believe, in the book. It's been so long since I read it. My memory's a little, but Lenore talked about sexual violence, she talked about physical violence, and she talked about psychological abuse too. In her book, she talked about really extreme forms. So a lot of people that we worked with didn't connect with it because they thought, well, that's not who I am, that's not who my partner is, because it was so extreme. There were really extreme cases. So we had a lot of victims of domestic violence who didn't think they were victims of domestic violence because they didn't fit in these extreme categories, or extreme descriptions, I should say.
Okay, I want to ask you some questions about what you know about the history of battered women. So and not like history as in school, but I mean history. If you have a woman that you're counseling, do you want to know about her history as well?
Her childhood?
Yes, her childhood.
I absolutely work with people's childhood history because what you see is sort of compound trauma. If you've got somebody who's been abused as a child and then grows up, maybe has been assaulted as a teenager or something, and then goes into an abusive relationship, there's a lot of vulnerability that comes from multiple trauma. So the other thing that we see is, and we looked at this when we looked at the research on battered women, that there was no consistency in the history of battered women. In other words, there were women from very healthy families. There were women from moderately healthy families, women from good families, women from very abusive families. There was the full range of women represented. So there was no consistency in the history of battered women, unlike with perpetrators, there's more consistency.
So with perpetrators, there's more consistency. With the more violent or traumatic a childhood, the more likely they are to become a batterer? Am I saying that correctly?
The more violent their history, or actually children tend to be affected even at low levels of domestic violence. So there's effects on children, and it depends on the resiliency of the child, the personality of the child. There's a lot of factors. If they have another family member they can count on, if there's community organization, there's a lot of compounding factors. But with perpetrators of domestic violence, they tend to they don't have to come from the worst abuse, but they are generally what are called exposed to domestic violence. Okay. So the new terminology are children exposed to domestic violence.
Children exposed, okay. And versus when we talk about women who are in abusive relationships or who are being abused, is that what you're talking about, that you see them come from all different types of families?
Yes, they don't have to come from abusive families to be abused.
Is there any research that talks about what happens if they come from an abusive family versus a healthy family? Is there any difference at all then?
There's I don't know about research on that. I haven't seen research on that. What we have with that is just a lot of talking to each other in the field about that. And what we tend to see anecdotally is that women who come from chronic abuse tend to repeat abusive relationships more frequently, and that women who come from basically healthy families tend to learn more from that situation, tend to leave more distance between relationships, and tend to be less likely to repeat.
Less likely to go into another abusive relationship, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there, in the women that you've treated, regarding either psychological abuse or physical abuse, is there something that women universally have been telling you about psychological or emotional abuse?
Women generally say that psychological and verbal abuse are worse for them than physical. Part of that is because there's usually a greater distance between episodes of physical abuse, and the psychological, emotional, verbal abuse tend to create the mood in the relationship, but it also is happening more frequently. So, there's articles on psychological, emotional abuse being mutilation of the soul, for instance. There's an article on that. But they generally will tell you that that's terrible for them.
And is it problematic, or do you find that psychological abuse can be subtle versus physical abuse? You know it when it's happening to you.
Yes, one thing about physical abuse is if somebody hits you, you can say, I got hit. If somebody says something to you and you're not quite sure, you feel like you've been stung, but you can't exactly explain why you feel like you've been stung. And then, of course, there's much more obvious psychological abuse too, but there's very subtle psychological abuse where people will say, sort of things you could take more than one way, but there's an edge to it. You know that it means something other than the nice way.
Is that what you were talking about earlier about the switching the perceptions, that the person, I think you gave us the example of the person getting hired. The partner comes home and says, hey, I got a new job, and oh, they must be hiring anybody.
Yeah.
And then he explains himself to say, oh, no, you just misunderstood me.
Right.
So is that an example of subtle psychological or emotional abuse?
That's an example of it. It could be anything. It could be, and once again, you're looking at a context, and you're not looking at an isolated situation. So I'm not talking about when somebody says, that dress makes you look fat. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about somebody who might say repeatedly, wow, are you gaining weight? Will you, you look great. I don't care if you gain weight.
So it's a, oh,
They can go on, they can say things like, I thought anybody would be able to figure that out, and then laugh about it. Or they call you a name and then laugh about it. Oh, I didn't mean that. There's so many ways that people can psychologically abuse, but what happens and what's important about it is that it becomes a mood in the relationship. It's not something that somebody says and then they don't say it again. It's something where there's a consistency in the treatment. There's a consistency in the way someone is treated.
okay. And does that make it more difficult with that subtlety? Does that make it more difficult then for somebody to either understand that it's happening or report it or tell somebody else?
It absolutely makes it difficult because it's hard to tell somebody, well, somebody I love said something to me and I'm not sure if they meant it, or they said this to me and somebody would say, well, anybody could say that. But it's the repetition. It's not saying that, it doesn't have to be the same thing, but it's the repetition that creates the mood, that creates the belief that says, this is who I am. This is what the person I love actually thinks of me. This is how they think I ought to be treated. This is what they think should be said to me.
And incidentally, does that have more impact on somebody when it's somebody that we love who tells us these things versus somebody that we don't know?
Yes, absolutely it does. I mean, it's not fun to hear things about who you are from people you don't know, but I do public speaking, and so, sometimes I get an evaluation that's not great. And when I look at that, I think, well, gee, I got these others and they're all good. And this person doesn't know me. And if they make constructive criticism, that's great, and I can look at it. But if they're just saying something to sort of be mean, it doesn't feel good, but they don't know me. They're not my family. They're not the people who I respect and care about their opinion like that. I mean, I care what people who are close to me think. Most of us care about what our friends and our family, we care about what they think about us. And so when somebody who loves us is tearing us apart, I mean, I don't think there's anything that hurts much worse than that.
Can we talk about the history of the abusive person for a second?
Sure.
And I know we've talked about, are there common risk markers?
The only common risk marker is exposure, because even when they look at things, they try to look at behaviors that, people are jealous or people are threatening or whatever. There's such a range with that behavior, but there's also a range in the level of what people do. There's a range in their childhood histories. So I'm not sure.
So we've talked about the common risk marker, in other words, being somebody who's coming from a traumatic childhood or a violent childhood.
Objection, we have an order, if we may approach, please.
You may. You may continue.
Let's talk about the children who are growing up in these homes, and that's what I was saying, is that we've discussed children who grow up in an abusive family. Do these children always turn out to have problems or turn out to be abusive themselves?
We'd actually have no way of knowing that because we don't have everybody in our programs but I would just say this, that if you grow up.
Sustained.
Do you know, do you have knowledge with regard to when, depending on the child's personality, does that make a difference?
It's an issue we discussed.
I'm asking if she has
All
knowledge.
right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the evening recess. The court has a matter tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, so I'm going to ask that you return at 10:45, and we will try to start promptly at that time. So 10:45 tomorrow morning. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. You may step down. Counsel, could I see you in the hallway, please, before you leave for the day?